An extravaganza. It was a chilly November afternoon. I had just consummated an unusually hearty dinner, of which the dyspeptic truff formed not the least important item, and was sitting alone in the dining room, with my feet upon the fender, and at my elbow a small table which I had rolled up to the fire, and upon which were some apologies for dessert, with some miscellaneous bottles of wine, spirit, and liqueur. In the morning I had been reading Glover's Leonidas, Wilkie's Epigoniad, Lamartine's Pilgrimage, Barlow's Columbiad, Tuckerman's Sicily, and Griswold's Curiosities. I am willing to confess, therefore, that I now felt a little stupid. I made effort to arouse myself by aid of frequent Lafitte, and, all failing, I betook myself to a stray newspaper in despair. Having carefully perused the column of houses to let, and the column of dogs lost, and then the two columns of wives and apprentices runaway, I attacked with great resolution the editorial matter, and, reading it from beginning to end without understanding a syllable, conceived the possibility of its being Chinese, and so reread it from the end to the beginning, but with no more satisfactory result. I was about throwing away, in disgust, this folio of 4 pages, happy work which not even poets criticize, when I felt my attention somewhat aroused by the paragraph which follows: "The avenues to death are numerous and strange. A London paper mentions the decease of a person from a singular cause. He was playing at Puff the Dart, which is played with a long needle inserted in some worsted, and blown at a target through a tin tube. He placed the needle at the wrong end of the tube, and drawing his breath strongly to puff the dart forward with force, drew the needle into his throat. It entered the lungs, and in a few days killed him. Upon seeing this I fell into a great rage, without exactly knowing why. This thing, I exclaimed, is a contemptible falsehood, a poor hoax, the lees of the invention of some pitiable penny a liner of some wretched concocter of accidents in cocaine. These fellows, knowing the extravagant gullibility of the age, set their wits to work in the imagination of probable possibilities of odd accidents, as they term them, but to a reflecting intellect, like mine, I added, in parenthesis, putting my forefinger unconsciously to the side of my nose, to a contemplative understanding such as I myself possess, it seems evident at once that the marvelous increase of late in these odd accidents is by far the oddest accident of all. For my own part, I intend to believe nothing henceforward that has anything of the singular about it. Mein Gott, den, wat will you bees for dat? Replied one of the most remarkable voices I ever heard. At first I took it for a rumbling in my ears such as a man sometimes experiences when getting very drunk, but, upon second thought, I considered the sound as more nearly resembling that which proceeds from an empty barrel beaten with a big stick, and, in fact, this I should have concluded it to be, but for the articulation of the syllables and words. I am by no means naturally nervous, and the very few glasses of Lafitte which I had sipped served to embolden me a little, so that I felt nothing of trepidation, but merely uplifted my eyes with a leisurely movement, and looked carefully around the room for the intruder. I could not, however, perceive anyone at all. "Humph!" resumed the voice, as I continued my survey, "you muse pe so dronk as de pig, den, for not see me as I zit here at your side." Hereupon I bethought me of looking immediately before my nose, and there, sure enough, confronting me at the table sat a personage nondescript, although not altogether indescribable. His body was a wine pipe, or a rum puncheon, or something of that character, and had a truly Falstaffian air. In its nether extremity were inserted 2 kegs, which seemed to answer all the purposes of legs. 4 arms there dangled from the upper portion of the carcass 2 tolerably long bottles, with the necks outward for hands. All the head that I saw the monster possessed of was like a Hessian canteen, which resembles a large snuff box with a hole in the middle of the lid. This canteen, with a funnel on its top, like a cavalier cap slouched over the eyes, was set on edge upon the puncheon, with the hole toward myself, and through this hole, which seemed puckered up like the mouth of a very precise old maid, the creature was emitting certain rumbling and grumbling noises which he evidently intended for intelligible talk. "Zay," said he, "you mos pe dronk as de pig, vor zit dere and not zie me zit air, and I zay, do, you most pe piggervol as de goose, vor to disbelief vat is print in de print. Tis de truth dat it is every vort ob it." "Who are you, pray?" said I, with much dignity, although somewhat puzzled. "How did you get here, and what is it you are talking about?" "As vor how I corn de air," replied the figure, "dat is none of your pizzicato. Ness, and as vor vat I be talking about, I be talk about vat I tink proper. And as vor who I be, vy dat is de very ting I corn de here for to let you see for yourself." "To you are a drunken vagabond," said I, "and I shall ring the bell and order my footman to kick you into the street." He, said the fellow, who, dat you can't do." "Can't do," said I, "what do you mean?" "I can't do what?" "Ring de bell," he replied, attempting a grin with M's little villainous mouth. Upon this I made an effort to get up, in order to put my threat into execution, but the ruffian just reached across the table very deliberately, and hitting me a tap on the forehead with the neck of one of the long bottles, knocked me back into the armchair from which I had half arisen. I was utterly astounded, and, for a moment, was quite at a loss what to do. In the meantime, he continued his talk. "You see," said he, "it is te bes vor zit still, and now you shall know who I pe. Look at me. Z. I am te angel ov te odd slash and odd enough, too," I ventured to reply, but I was always under the impression that an angel had wings. "Te wing," he cried, highly incensed, "vat I pe do mit te wing? Mein God! Do you take me vor a chicken?" "No, oh, no," I replied, much alarmed, "you are no chicken, certainly not." "Well, den, zit still and pehabe yourself, or I'll rap you again mid me vist. It is te chicken of te wing, und te owl of te wing, und te imp of de wing, and te head turtle of te wing. Te angel of not te wing, and I am te angel ov te oj, and your business with me at present is. "My business," ejaculated the thing, "vyvot a low-bred puppy you mos pe vor to ask a gentleman und an angel about his business." This language was rather more than I could bear, even from an angel, so, plucking up courage, I seized a salt cellar which lay within reach, and hurled at the head of the intruder. Either he dodged, however, or my aim was inaccurate, for all I accomplished was the demolition of the crystal which protected the dial of the clock upon the mantelpiece. As for the angel, he evinced his sense of my assault by giving me 2 or 3 hard consecutive raps upon the forehead as before. These reduced me at once to submission, and I am almost ashamed to confess that, either through pain or vexation, there came a few tears into my eyes. "Mein God," said the angel of the odd, apparently much softened at my distress, "mein God, te man is eder fairy drunk or fairy sorry. You mos not trink it so strong, you mos put de water in te wine. Here, trink dis, like a good veller, und don't gry now don't." Hereupon the angel of the odd replenished my goblet, which was about a third full of port, with a colorless fluid that he poured from one of his hand bottles. I observed that these bottles had labels about their necks, and that these labels were inscribed Kirchenwasser. The considerate kindness of the angel mollified me in no little measure, and, aided by the water with which he diluted my port more than once, I at length regained sufficient temper to listen to his very extraordinary discourse. I cannot pretend to recount all that he told me, but I gleaned from what he said that he was the genius who presided over the contretemps of mankind, and whose business it was to bring about the odd accidents which are continually astonishing the skeptic. Once or twice, upon my venturing to express my total incredulity in respect to his pretensions, he grew very angry indeed, so that at length I considered it the wiser policy to say nothing at all, and let him have his own way. He talked on, therefore, at great length, while I merely leaned back in my chair with my eyes shut, and amused myself with munching raisins and filliping the stems about the room. But, by and by, the angel suddenly construed this behavior of mine into contempt. He arose in a terrible passion, slouched his funnel down over his eyes, swore a vast oath, uttered a threat of some character which I did not precisely comprehend, and finally made me a low bow and departed, wishing me, in the language of the Archbishop in Gil Blas, beaucoup de bonheur et un pen plus de bon sens. His departure afforded me relief. The very few glasses of Lafitte that I had sipped had the effect of rendering me drowsy, and I felt inclined to take a nap of some 15 or 20 minutes, as is my custom after din. At 6 I had an appointment of consequence, which it was quite indispensable that I should keep. The policy of insurance for my dwelling house had expired the day before, and, some dispute having arisen, it was agreed that, at 6, I should meet the board of directors of the company, and settle the terms of a renewal. Glancing upward at the clock on the mantelpiece, for I felt too drowsy to take out my watch, I had the pleasure to find that I had still 25 minutes to spare. It was 5:30, I could easily walk to the insurance office in 5 minutes, and my usual siestas had never been known to exceed 25. I felt sufficiently safe, therefore, and composed myself to my slumbers forthwith. Having completed them to my satisfaction, I again looked toward the timepiece, and was half inclined to believe in the possibility of odd accidents when I found that, instead of my ordinary 15 or 20 minutes, I had been dozing only 3, for it still wanted 27 of the appointed hour. I betook myself again to my nap, and at length the second time awoke, when, to my utter amazement, it still wanted 27 minutes of 6. I jumped up to examine the clock, and found that it had ceased running. My watch informed me that it was 7:30, and, of course, having slept 2 hours, I was too late for my appointment. "TT will make no difference," I said, "I can call at the office in the morning and apologize. In the meantime, what can be the matter with the clock?" Upon examining it, I discovered that one of the raisin stems which I had been filliping about the room during the discourse of the angel of the odd had flown through the fractured crystal, and lodging, singularly enough, in the keyhole, with an end projecting outward, had thus arrested the revolution of the minute hand. "Ah," said I see how it is. This thing speaks for itself. A natural accident, such as will happen now and then." I gave the matter no further consideration, and at my usual hour retired to bed. Here, having placed a candle upon a reading stand at the bedhead, and having made an attempt to peruse some pages of the Omnipresence of the Deity, I unfortunately fell asleep in less than 20 seconds, leaving the light burning as it was. My dreams were terrifically disturbed by visions of the angel of the odd. Methought he stood at the foot of the couch, drew aside the curtains, and, in the hollow, detestable tones of a rumpuncheon, menaced me with the bitterest vengeance for the contempt with which I had treated him. He concluded a long harangue by taking off his funnel cap, inserting the tube into my gullet, and thus deluging me with an ocean of Kirschenwasser, which he poured, in a continuous flood, from one of the long-necked bottles that stood him instead of an arm. My agony was at length insufferable, and I awoke just in time to perceive that a rat had run off with the lighted candle from the stand, but not in season to prevent his making his escape with it through the hole. Very soon, a strong suffocating odor assailed my nostrils. The house, I clearly perceived, was on fire. In a few minutes the blaze broke forth with violence, and in an incredibly brief period the entire building was wrapped in flames. All egress from my chamber, except through a window, was cut off. The crowd, however, quickly procured and raised a long ladder. By means of this I was descending rapidly, and in apparent safety, when a huge hog, about whose rotund stomach, and indeed about whose whole air and physiognomy, there was something which reminded me of the angel of the odd, when this hog, I say, which hitherto had been quietly slumbering in the mud, took it suddenly into his head that his left shoulder needed scratching, and could find no more convenient rubbing post than that afforded by the foot of the ladder. In an instant I was precipitated, and had the misfortune to fracture my arm. This accident, with the loss of my insurance, and with the more serious loss of my hair, the whole of which had been singed off by the fire, predisposed me to serious impressions, so that, finally, I made up my mind to take a wife. There was a rich widow disconsolate for the loss of her seventh husband, and to her wounded spirit I offered the balm of my vows. She yielded a reluctant consent to my prayers. I knelt at her feet in gratitude and adoration. She blushed, and bowed her luxuriant tresses into close contact with those supplied me, temporarily, by Grandjean. I know not how the entanglement took place, but so it was. I arose with a shining pate, wigless, she in disdain and wrath, half buried in alien hair. Thus ended my hopes of the widow by an accident which could not have been anticipated, to be sure, but which the natural sequence of events had brought about. Without despairing, however, I undertook the siege of a less implacable heart. The fates were again propitious for a brief period, but again a trivial incident interfered. Meeting my betrothed in an avenue thronged with the elite of the city, I was hastening to greet her with one of my best considered bows, when a small particle of some foreign matter, lodging in the corner of my eye, rendered me, for the moment, completely blind. Before I could recover my sight, the lady of my love had disappeared, irreparably affronted at what she chose to consider my premeditated rudeness in passing her by ungreeted. While I stood bewildered at the suddenness of this accident, which might have happened, nevertheless, to any one under the sun, and while I still continued incapable of sight, I was accosted by the angel of the odd, who proffered me his aid with a civility which I had no reason to expect. He examined my disordered eye with much gentleness and skill, informed me that I had a drop in it, and, whatever a drop was, took it out, and afforded me relief. I now considered it high time to die, since fortune had so determined to persecute me, and accordingly made my way to the nearest river. Here, divesting myself of my clothes, for there is no reason why we cannot die as we were born, I threw myself headlong into the current. The sole witness of my fate being a solitary crow that had been seduced into the eating of brandy-saturated corn, and so had staggered away from his fellows. No sooner had I entered the water than this bird took it into its head to fly away with the most indispensable portion of my apparel, postponing, therefore, for the present, my suicidal design. I just slipped my nether extremities into the sleeves of my coat, and betook myself to it. Pursuit of the felon with all the nimbleness which the case required and its circumstances would admit. But my evil destiny attended me still. As I ran at full speed, with my nose up in the atmosphere, and intent only upon the purloiner of my property, I suddenly perceived that my feet rested no longer upon terra firma. The fact is, I had thrown myself over a precipice, and should inevitably have been dashed to pieces but for my good fortune in grasping the end of a long guide rope, which depended from a passing balloon. As soon as I sufficiently recovered my senses to comprehend the terrific predicament in which I stood, or rather hung, I exerted all the power of my lungs to make that predicament known to the aeronaut overhead. But for a long time I exerted myself in vain. Either the fool could not, or the villain would not perceive me. Meantime the machine rapidly soared, while my strength even more rapidly failed. I was soon upon the point of resigning myself to my fate, and dropping quietly into the sea, when my spirits were suddenly revived by hearing a hollow voice from above, which seemed to be lazily humming an opera air. Looking up, I perceived the angel of the odd. He was leaning with his arms folded, over the rim of the car, and with a pipe in his mouth, at which he puffed leisurely, seemed to be upon excellent terms with himself and the universe. I was too much exhausted to speak, so I merely regarded him with an imploring air. For several minutes, although he looked me full in the face, he said nothing. At length, removing carefully his meerschaum from the right to the left corner of his mouth, he condescended to speak. "Who pe you?" he asked. und what der Teufel upe do dare. To this piece of impudence, cruelty, and affectation, I could reply only by ejaculating the monosyllable help. Help, I echoed the ruffian, not I, dare is te pottle help yourself, undpe tamd. With these words he let fall a heavy bottle of Kirchenwasser which, dropping precisely upon the crown of my head, caused me to imagine that my brains were entirely knocked out. Impressed with this idea, I was about to relinquish my hold and give up the ghost with a good grace, when I was arrested by the cry of the angel, who bade me hold on. Hold on, he said, don't pe in te yuri don't. Will you pe take de otter pottle, or ave you pe got sober yet and come to your senses? I made haste, hereupon, to nod my head twice, once in the negative, meaning thereby that I would prefer not taking the other bottle at press. And once in the affirmative, intending thus to imply that I was sober and had positively come to my senses. By these means I somewhat softened the angel. You believe, 10, he inquired, at te last? You believe, 10, in te possibility of te odd. I again nodded my head in assent. You ave believe in we, te angel ov te odd. I nodded again. You acknowledge tat you te blind drunk and te vol. I nodded once more. Put your right hand into your left hand pre-ches pocket, 10, in token ov your volzubmazion unto te angel ov te odd. This thing, for very obvious reasons, I found it quite impossible to do. In the first place, my left arm had been broken in my fall from the ladder, and, therefore, had I let go my hold with the right hand, I must have let go altogether. In the second place, I could have no breeches until I came across the crow. I was therefore obliged, much to my regret, to shake my head in the negative, intending thus to give the angel to understand that I found it inconvenient, just at that moment, to comply with his very reasonable demand. No sooner, however, had I ceased shaking my head than go to der Teufel, 10, roared the angel of the odd. In pronouncing these words, he drew a sharp knife across the guide rope by which I was suspended, and as we then happened to be precisely over my own house, which, during my peregrinations, had been handsomely rebuilt, it so occurred that I tumbled headlong down the ample chimney and alit upon the dining room hearth. Upon coming to my senses, for the fall had very thoroughly stunned me, I found it about 4 o'clock in the morning. I lay outstretched where I had fallen from the balloon. My head grovelled in the ashes of an extinguished fire, while my feet reposed upon the wreck of a small table, overthrown, and amid the fragments of a miscellaneous dessert, intermingled with a newspaper, some broken glass and shattered bottles, and an empty jug of the Schiedam Kirchenwasser. Thus revenged himself the angel of the odd. On board balloon Skylark, April I, 2848. Now, my dear friend, now, for your sins, you are to suffer the infliction of a long gossiping letter. I tell you distinctly that I am going to punish you for all your impertinences by being as tedious, as discursive, as incoherent, and as unsatisfactory as possible. Besides, here I am, cooped up in a dirty balloon, with some 100 or 200 of the Canal J all bound on a pleasure excursion. What a funny idea some people have of pleasure, and I have no prospect of touching terra firma for a month at least. Nobody to talk to. Nothing to do. When one has nothing to do, then is the time to correspond with one's friends. You perceive, then, why it is that I write you this letter. It is on account of my ennui and your sins. Get ready your spectacles and make up your mind to be annoyed. I mean to write at you every day during this odious voyage. Hego. When will any invention visit the human pericranium? Are we forever to be doomed to the 1,000 inconveniences of the balloon? Will nobody contrive a more expeditious mode of progress? The jog-trot move meant, to my thinking, is little less than positive torture. Upon my word, we have not made more than 100 miles the hour since leaving home. The very birds beat us, at least some of them. I assure you that I do not exaggerate at all. Our motion, no doubt, seems slower than it actually is, this on account of our having no objects about us by which to estimate our velocity, and on account of our going with the wind. To be sure, whenever we meet a balloon we have a chance of perceiving our rate, and then, I admit, things do not appear so very bad. Accustomed as I am to this mode of traveling, I cannot get over a kind of giddiness whenever a balloon passes us in a current directly overhead. It always seems to me like an immense bird of prey about to pounce upon us and carry us off in its claws. One went over us this morning about sunrise, and so nearly overhead that its drag rope actually brushed the network suspending our car, and caused us very serious apprehension. Our captain said that if the material of the bag had been the trumpery varnished silk of 500 or 1,000 years ago, we should inevitably have been damaged. This silk, as he explained it to me, was a fabric composed of the entrails of a species of earthworm. The worm was carefully fed on mulberries, kind of fruit resembling a watermelon, and, when sufficiently fat, was crushed in a mill. The paste thus arising was called papyrus in its primary state, and went through a variety of processes until it finally became silk. Singular to relate, it was once much admired as an article of female dress. Balloons were also very generally constructed from it. A better kind of material, it appears, was subsequently found in the down surrounding the seed vessels of a plant vulgarly called euphorbium, and at that time botanically termed milkweed. This latter kind of silk was designated as silk Buckingham, on account of its superior durability, and was usually prepared for use by being varnished with a solution of gum caoutchouc, a substance which in some respects must have resembled the gutta percha now in common use. This caoutchouc was occasionally called Indian rubber or rubber of twist, and was no doubt one of the numerous fungi. Never tell me again that I am not at heart an antiquarian. Talking of drag ropes, our own, it seems, has this moment knocked a man overboard from one of the small magnetic propellers that swarm in ocean below us, a boat of about 6,000 tons, and, from all accounts, shamefully crowded. These diminutive barks should be prohibited from carrying more than a definite number of passengers. The man, of course, was not permitted to get on board again, and was soon out of sight, he and his life preserver. I rejoice, my dear friend, that we live in an age so enlightened that no such a thing as an individual is supposed to exist. It is the mass for which the true humanity cares. By the by, talking of humanity, do you know that our immortal Wiggins is not so original in his views of the social condition and so forth, as his contemporaries are inclined to suppose? Pundit assures me that the same ideas were put nearly in the same way, about 1,000 years ago, by an Irish philosopher called Furrier, on account of his keeping a retail shop for cat peltries and other furs. Pundit knows, you know, there can be no mistake about it. How very wonderfully do we see verified every day, the profound observation of the Hindu Aristotle, as quoted by Pundit. Thus must we say that, not once or twice, or a few times, but with almost infinite repetitions, the same opinions come round in a circle among men. April 2d, spoke today the magnetic cutter in charge of the middle section of floating telegraph wires. I learned that when this species of telegraph was first put into operation by Horse, it was considered quite impossible to convey the wires over sea, but now we are at a loss to compare. And where the difficulty lay. So wags the world. Tempora mutantur, excuse me for quoting the Etruscan. What would we do without the Atlantic telegraph? Pundit says Atlantic was the ancient adjective. We lay to a few minutes to ask the cutter some questions, and learned, among other glorious news, that civil war is raging in Africa, while the plague is doing its good work beautifully both in Europe and Asia. Is it not truly remarkable that, before the magnificent light shed upon philosophy by humanity, the world was accustomed to regard war and pestilence as calamities? Do you know that prayers were actually offered up in the ancient temples to the end that these evils might not be visited upon mankind? Is it not really difficult to comprehend upon what principle of interest our forefathers acted? Were they so blind as not to perceive that the destruction of a myriad of individuals is only so much positive advantage to the mass? April 3. It is really a very fine amusement to ascend the rope ladder leading to the summit of the balloon bag, and then survey the surrounding world. From the car below you know the prospect is not so comprehensive, you can see little vertically. But seated here, where I write this, in the luxuriously cushioned open piazza of the summit, one can see everything that is going on in all directions. Just now there is quite a crowd of balloons in sight, and they present a very animated appearance, while the air is resonant with the hum of so many millions of human voices. I have heard it asserted that when Yellow or, pundit will have it, Violet, who is supposed to have been the first aeronaut, maintained the practicability of traversing the atmosphere in all directions, by merely ascending or descending until a favorable current was attained, he was scarcely hearkened to at all by his contemporaries, who looked upon him as merely an ingenious sort of madman, because the philosophers of the day declared the thing impossible. Really now it does seem to me quite unaccountable how anything so obviously feasible could have escaped the sagacity of the ancient savants. But in all ages the great obstacles to advancement in art have been opposed by the so-called men of science. To be sure, our men of science are not quite so bigoted as those of old. Oh, I have something so queer to tell you on this topic. Do you know that it is not more than 1,000 years ago since the metaphysicians consented to relieve the people of the singular fancy that there existed but two possible roads for the attainment of truth? Believe it if you can. It appears that long ago, in the night of time, there lived a Turkish philosopher, or Hindu possibly, called Aristotle. This person introduced, or at all events propagated what was termed the deductive or a priori mode of investigation. He started with what he maintained to be axioms or self-evident truths, and thence proceeded logically to results. His greatest disciples were one Euclid, and one Kant. Well, Aristotle flourished supreme until advent of one Hogg, surnamed the Ettrick Shepherd, who preached an entirely different system, which he called the a posteriori or fuductive. His plan referred altogether to sensation. He proceeded by observing, analyzing, and classifying facts instantum naturam, as they were affectedly called, into general laws. Aristotle's mode, in a word, was based on noumena, Hogg's on phenomena. Well, so great was the admiration excited by this latter system that, at its first in 387 traduction, Aristotle fell into disrepute, but finally he recovered ground and was permitted to divide the realm of truth with his more modern rival. The savants now maintain that the Aristotelian and Baconian roads were the sole possible avenues to knowledge. Baconian / you must know, was an adjective invented as equivalent to Hoggian and more euphonious and dignified. Now, my dear friend, I do assure you, most positively, that I represent this matter fairly, on the soundest authority, and you can easily understand how a notion so absurd on its very face must have operated to retard the progress of all true knowledge, which makes its advances almost invariably by intuitive bounds. The ancient idea confined investigations to crawling, and for hundreds of years so great was the infatuation about Hogg especially, that a virtual end was put to all thinking, properly so called. No man dared utter a truth to which he felt himself indebted to his soul alone. It mattered not whether the truth was even demonstrably a truth, for the bullet-headed savants of the time regarded only the road by which he had attained it. They would not even look at the end. See the means, they cried, the means. If, upon investigation of the means, it was found to come under neither the category Aries, that is to say Ram, npr under the category Hogg, why then the savants went no farther, but pronounced the theorist a fool, and would have nothing to do with him or his truth. Now, it cannot be maintained, even, that by the crawling system the greatest amount of truth would be attained in any long series of ages, for the repression of imagination was an evil not to be compensated for by any superior certainty in the ancient modes of investigation. The error of these Germains, these French, these English, and these Americans, the latter, by the way, were our own immediate progenitors, was an error quite analogous with that of the wiseacre who fancies that he must necessarily see an object the better the more closely he holds it to his eyes. These people blinded themselves by details. When they proceeded hoggishly, their facts were by no means always facts, matter of little consequence had it not been for assuming that they were facts and must be facts because they appeared to be such. When they proceeded on the path of the ram, their course was scarcely as straight as a ram's horn, for they never had an axiom which was an axiom at all. They must have been very blind not to see this, even in their own day, for even in their own day many of the long-established axioms had been rejected. For example, nihilo nihil fit asterisk, a body cannot act where it is not, there cannot exist antipodes, darkness cannot come out of light. All these, and a due to and other similar propositions, formerly admitted without hesitation as axioms, were, even at the period of which I speak, seen to be untenable. How absurd in these people, then, to persist in putting faith in axioms as immutable bases of truth. But even out of the mouths of their soundest reasoners it is easy to demonstrate the futility, the impalpability of their axioms in general. Who was the soundest of their logicians? Let me see. I will go and ask Pundit and be back in a minute. Asterisk 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 here we have it. Here is a book written nearly 1,000 years ago and lately translated from the English, which, by the way, appears to have been the rudiment of the Amrican. Pundit says it is decidedly the cleverest ancient work on its topic, logic. The author, who was much thought of in his day, was one Miller or Mill, and we find it recorded of him, as a point of some importance, that he had a mill horse called Bentham. But let us glance at the treatise. Ability or inability to conceive, says Mr. Mill, very properly, is in no case to be received as a criterion of axiomatic truth. What modern in his senses would ever think of disputing this truism? The only wonder with us must be, how it happened that Mr. Mill conceived it necessary even to hint at anything so obvious. So far good, but let us turn over another paper. What have we here? Contradictories cannot both be true, that is, cannot coexist in nature. Here Mr. Mill means, for example, that a tree must be either a tree or not a tree, that it cannot be at the same time a tree and not a tree. Very well, but I ask him why. His reply is this, and never pretends to be anything else than this, because it is impossible to conceive that contradictories can both be true. But this is no answer at all, by his own showing, for has he not just admitted as a truism that ability or inability to conceive is in no case to be received as a criterion of axiomatic truth? Now I do not complain of these ancients so much because their logic is, by their own showing, utterly baseless, worthless and fantastic altogether, as because of their pompous and imbecile proscription of all other roads of truth, of all other means for its attainment than the two preposterous paths, the one of creeping and the one of crawling, to which they have dared to confine the soul that loves nothing so well as to soar. By the by, my dear friend, do you not think it would have puzzled these ancient dogmatic eons to have determined by which of their two roads it was that the most important and most sublime of all their truths was, in effect, attained? I mean the truth of gravitation. Newton owed it to Kepler. Kepler admitted that his three laws were guessed at, these three laws of all laws which led the great English mathematician to his principle, the basis of all physical principle, to go behind which we must enter the kingdom of metaphysics. Kepler guessed, that is to say, imagined. He was essentially a theorist, that word now of so much sanctity, formerly an epithet of contempt. Would it not have puzzled these old moles too, to have explained by which of the two roads a septographist unriddles a cryptograph of more than usual secrecy, or by which of the two roads Champollion directed mankind to those enduring and almost innumerable truths which resulted from his deciphering the hieroglyphics? One word more on this topic and I will be done boring you. Is it not passing strange that, with their eternal prattling about roads to truth, these bigoted people missed what we now so clearly perceive to be the great highway, that of consistency? Does it not seem singular how they should have failed to deduce from the works of God the vital fact that a perfect consistency must be an absolute truth? How plain has been our progress since the late announcement of this proposition. Investigation has been taken out of the hands of the ground moles and given, as a task, to the true and only true thinkers, the men of ardent imagination. These latter theorize. Can you not fancy the shout of scorn with which my words would be received by our progenitors were it possible for them to be now looking over my shoulder? These men, I say, theorize, and their theories are simply corrected, reduced, systematized, cleared, little by little, of their dross of inconsistency until, finally, a perfect consistency stands apparent which even the most stolid admit, because it is a consistency, to be an absolute and an unquestionable truth. April JTH. The new gas is doing wonders, in conjunction with the new improvement with gutta percha. How very safe, commodious, manageable, and in every respect convenient are our modern balloons. Here is an immense one approaching us at the rate of at least 150 miles an hour. It seems to be crowded with people. Perhaps there are 300 or 400 passengers, and yet it soars to an elevation of nearly a mile, looking down upon poor us with sovereign contempt. Still 100 or even 200 miles an hour is slow traveling after all. Do you remember our flight on the railroad across the Canada continent? Fully 300 miles the hour that was traveling. Nothing to be seen, though nothing to be done but flirt, feast, and dance in the magnificent saloons. Do you remember what an odd sensation was experienced when, by chance, we caught a glimpse of external objects while the cars were in full flight? Everything seemed unique in one mass. For my part, I cannot say but that I preferred the traveling by the slow train of 100 miles the hour. Here we were permitted to have glass windows, even to have them open, and something like a distinct view of the country was attainable. Pundit says that the route for the Great Canada Railroad must have been in some measure marked out about 900 years ago. In fact, he goes so far as to assert that actual traces of a road are still discernible, traces referable to a period quite as remote as that mentioned. The track, it appears, was double only. Ours, you know, has 12 paths, and 3 or 4 new ones are in preparation. The ancient rails are very slight, and placed so close together as to be, according to modern notions, quite frivolous, if not dangerous in the extreme. The present width of track 50 feet is considered, indeed, scarcely secure enough. For my part, I make no doubt that a track of some sort must have existed in very remote times, as Pundit asserts, for nothing can be clearer, to my mind, than that, at some period not less than 7 centuries ago, certainly the northern and southern Canada continents were united. The Canadians, then, would have been driven, by necessity, to a great railroad across the continent. April $th. Am almost devoured by Anu. Pundit is the only conversable person on board, and he, poor soul, can speak of nothing but antiquities. He has been occupied all the day in the attempt to convince me that the ancient Amricans governed themselves. Did ever anybody hear of such an absurdity? That they existed in a sort of every man for himself confederacy, after the fashion of the prairie dogs that we read of in fable. He says that they started with the queerest idea conceivable, viz., that all men are born free and equal, this in the very teeth of the laws of gradation so visibly impressed upon all things both in the moral and physical universe. Every man voted, as they called it, that is to say meddled with public affairs, until, at length, it was discovered that what is everybody's business is nobody's, and that the Republic, so the absurd thing was called, was without a government at all. It is related, however, that the first circumstance which disturbed, very particularly, the self-complacency of the philosophers who constructed this republic, was the startling discovery that universal suffrage gave opportunity for fraudulent schemes, by means of which any desired number of votes might at any time be polled, without the possibility of prevention or even detection, by any party which should be merely villainous enough not to be ashamed of the fraud. A little reflection upon this discovery sufficed to render evident the consequences, which were that rascality must predominate, in a word, that a republican government could never be anything but a rascally one. While the philosophers, however, were busied in blushing at their stupidity in not having foreseen these inevitable evils, and intent upon the invention of new theories, the matter was put to an abrupt issue by a fellow of the name of Mob, who took everything into his own hands and set up a despotism, in comparison with which those of the fabulous Zeros and Hellophagabalises were respectable and delectable. This Mob, a foreigner, by the by, is said to have been the most odious of all men that ever encumbered the earth. He was a giant in stature, insolent, rapacious, filthy, had the gall of a bullock with the heart of a hyena and the brains of a peacock. He died, at length, by dint of his own energies, which exhausted him. Nevertheless, he had his uses, as everything has, however vile, and taught mankind a lesson which to this day it is in no danger of forgetting, never to run directly contrary to the nature. 391 Ral Analogies. As for republicanism, no analogy could be found for it upon the face of the earth unless we accept the case of the prairie dogs, an exception which seems to demonstrate, if anything, that democracy is a very admirable form of government for dogs. April 6 last night had a fine view of Alpha Lyrae, whose disk, through our captain's spyglass, subtends an angle of half a degree, looking very much as our sun does to the naked eye on a misty day. Alpha Lyrae, although so very much larger than our sun, by the by, resembles him closely as regards its spots, its atmosphere, and in many other particulars. It is only within the last century, pundit tells me, that the binary relation existing between these two orbs began even to be suspected. The evident motion of our system in the heavens was, strange to say, referred to an orbit about a prodigious star in the center of the galaxy. About this star, or at all events about a center of gravity common to all the globes of the Milky Way and supposed to be near Alcyone in the Pleiades, every one of these globes was declared to be revolving, our own performing the circuit in a period of 117 million of years. We with our present lights, our vast telescopic improvements, and so forth, of course find it difficult to comprehend the ground of an idea such as this. Its first propagator was one Muddler. He was led, we must presume, to this wild hypothesis by mere analogy in the first instance, but, this being the case, he should have at least adhered to analogy in its development. A great central orb was, in fact, suggested, so far Muddler was consistent. This central orb, however, dynamically, should have been greater than all its surrounding orbs taken together. The question might then have been asked, why do we not see it? We, especially, who occupy the mid-region of the cluster, the very locality near which, at least, must be situated this inconceivable central sun. The astronomer, perhaps, at this point, took refuge in the suggestion of non-luminosity, and here analogy was suddenly let fall. But even admitting the central orb non-luminous, how did he manage to explain its failure to be rendered visible by the incalculable host of glorious suns glaring in all directions about it? No doubt what he finally maintained was merely a center of gravity common to all the revolving orbs, but here again analogy must have been let fall. Our system revolves, it is true, about a common center of gravity, but it does this in connection with and in consequence of a material sun whose mass more than counterbalances the rest of the system. The mathematical circle is a curve composed of an infinity of straight lines, but this idea of the circle, this idea of it which, in regard to all earthly geometry, we consider as merely the mathematical, in contradistinction from the practical, idea is, in sober fact, the practical conception which alone we have any right to entertain in respect to those titanic circles with which we have to deal, at least in fancy, when we suppose our system, with its fellows, revolving about a point in the center of the galaxy. Let the most vigorous of human imaginations but attempt to take a single step toward the comprehension of a circuit so unutterable. It would scarcely be paradoxical to say that a flash of lightning itself, traveling forever upon the circumference of this inconceivable circle, would still forever be traveling in a straight line. That the path of our sun along such a circumference, that the direction of our system in such an orbit would, to any human perception, deviate in the slightest degree from a straight line even in a million of years, is a proposition not to be entertained, and yet these ancient astronomers were absolutely cajoled, it appears, into believing that a decisive curvature had become apparent during the brief period of their astronomical history, during the mere point, during the utter nothingness of 2,000 or 3,000 years. How incomprehensible, that considerations such as this did not at once indicate to them the true state of affairs, that of the binary revolution of our Sun and Alpha Lyrae around a common center of gravity. April ph. Continued last night our astronomical amusements. Had a fine view of the 5 Neptunian asteroids, and watched with much interest the putting up of a huge impost on a couple of lintels in the new temple at Daphnis in the moon. It was amusing to think that creatures so diminutive as the Lunarians, and bearing so little resemblance to humanity, yet evinced a mechanical ingenuity so much superior to our own. One finds it difficult, too, to conceive the vast masses which these people handle so easily, to be as light as our own reason tells us they actually are. April %th, Eureka. Pundit is in his glory. A balloon from Canada spoke us today and threw on board several late papers. They contain some exceedingly curious information relative to Canadian, or rather American, antiquities. You know, I presume, that laborers have for some months been employed in preparing the ground for a new fountain at Paradise, the Emperor's principal pleasure garden. Paradise, it appears, has been, literally speaking, an island time out of mind, that is to say, its northern boundary was always, as far back as any record extends, a rivulet, or rather a very narrow arm of the sea. This arm was gradually widened until it attained its present breadth, or mile. The whole length of the island is 9 miles, the breadth varies materially. The entire area, so Pundit says, was, about 800 years ago, densely packed with houses, some of them 20 stories high, land, for some most unaccountable reason, being considered as especially precious just in this vicinity. The disastrous earthquake, however, of the year 2050, so totally uprooted and overwhelmed the town, for it was almost too large to be called a village, that the most indefatigable of our antiquarians have never yet been able to obtain from the site any sufficient data, in the shape of coins, medals or inscriptions, wherewith to build up even the ghost of a theory concerning the manners, customs, etc., 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 of the aboriginal inhabitants. Nearly all that we have hitherto known of them is, that they were a portion of the Knickerbocker tribe of savages infesting the continent at its first discovery by Recorder Riker, a Knight of the Golden Fleece. They were by no means uncivilized, however, but cultivated various arts and even sciences after a fashion of their own. It is related of them that they were acute in many respects, but were oddly afflicted with monomania for building what, in the ancient American, was denominated churches, a kind of pagoda instituted for the worship of 2 idols that went by the names of Wealth and Fashion. In the end, it is said, the island became, 9/10 of it, church. The women, too, it appears, were oddly deformed by a natural protuberance of the region just below the small of the back, although, most unaccountably, this deformity was looked upon altogether in the light of a beauty. 1 or 2 pictures of these singular women have, in fact, been miraculously preserved. They look very odd, houri like something between a turkey cock and a dromedary. Well, these few details are nearly all that have descended to us respecting the ancient Knickerbockers. It seems, however, that while digging in the center of the Emperor's garden, which, you know, covers the whole island, some of the workmen unearthed a cubical and evidently chiseled block of granite, weighing several hundred pounds. It was in good preservation, having received, apparently, little injury from the convulsion which entombed it. On one of its surfaces was a marble slab with, only think of it, an inscription, a legible inscription. Pundit is in ecstasies. Upon detaching the slab, a cavity appeared, containing a leaden box filled with various coins, a long scroll of names, several documents which appear to resemble newspapers, with other matters of intense interest to the antiquarian. There can be no doubt that all these are genuine Amric relics belonging to the tribe called Knickerbocker. The papers thrown on board our balloon are filled with facsimiles of the coins, manuscripts, typography, etc., etc. I copy for your amusement the Knickerbocker inscription on the marble slab. This cornerstone of a monument to the memory of George Washington, was laid with appropriate ceremonies on the 19th day of October, 1847, the anniversary of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis to General Washington at Yorktown, A.D. 1781, under the auspices of the Washington Monument Association of the DTY of New York. This, as I give it, is a verbatim translation done by Pundit himself, so there can be no mistake about it. From the few words thus preserved, we glean several important items of knowledge, not the least interesting of which is the fact that 1,000 years ago actual monuments had fallen into disuse, as was all very proper, the people contenting themselves, as we do now, with a mere indication of the design to erect a monument at some future time, a cornerstone being cautiously laid by itself solitary and alone. Excuse me for quoting the great American poet Benton I, as a guarantee of the magnanimous intention. We ascertain, too, very distinctly, from this admirable inscription, the how as well as the where and the what, of the great surrender in question. As to the where, it was Yorktown, wherever that was, and as to the what, it was General Cornwallis, no doubt some wealthy dealer in corn. He was surrendered. The inscription commemorates the surrender of what? Why, of Lord Cornwallis. The only question is, what could the savages wish him surrendered for? But when we remember that these savages were undoubtedly cannibals, we are led to the conclusion that they intended him for sausage. As to the how of the surrender, no language can be more explicit. Lord Cornwallis was surrendered, for sausage, under the auspices of the Washington Monument Association, no doubt a charitable institution for the depositing of cornerstones. But, heaven bless me! What is the matter? Ah, I see the balloon has collapsed, and we shall have a tumble into the sea. I have, therefore, only time enough to add that, from a hasty inspection of the facsimiles of newspapers, etc., etc., I find that the great men in those days among the Americans, were one John, a smith, and one Zachary, a tailor. Goodbye, until I see you again. Whether you ever get this letter or not is point of little importance, as I write altogether for my own amusement. I shall cork the MS up in a bottle, however, and throw it into the sea. Yours everlastingly, Pundita. A tale neither in nor out of Blackwood 0 breathe not, etc. Amour's melodies. The most notorious ill fortune must, in the end, yield to the untiring courage of philosophy as the most stubborn city to the ceaseless vigilance of an enemy. Shalmaneser, as we have it in the holy writings, lay 3 years before Samaria, yet it fell. Sardanapalus C. Diodorus maintained himself 7 in Nineveh, but to no purpose. Troy expired at the close of the second lustrum, and Azoth, as Aristeas declares upon his honor as a gentleman, opened at last her gates to Samanitas, after having barred them for the 5th part of a century. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Thou wretch! Thou vixen! Thou shrew, said I to my wife on the morning after our wedding, thou witch! Thou hag! Thou whippersnapper! Thou sink of iniquity! Thou fiery-faced quintessence of all that is abominable! Thou here standing upon tiptoe, seizing her by the throat, and placing my mouth close to her ear, I was preparing to launch forth a new and more decided epithet of opprobrium, which should not fail, if ejaculated, to convince her of her insignificance, when, to my extreme horror and astonishment, I discovered that one had lost my breath. The phrases "I am out of breath," I have lost my breath, etc., are often enough repeated in common conversation, but it had never occurred to me that the terrible accident of which I speak could bona fide and actually happen. Imagine, that is, if you have a fanciful turn. Imagine, I say, my wonder, my consternation, my despair. There is a good genius, however, which has never entirely deserted me. In my most ungovernable moods I still retain a sense of propriety, etle chemin des passions me conduit, as Lord Edouard in the Julie says it did him, a la philosophie véritable. Although I could not at first precisely ascertain to what degree the occurrence had affected me, I determined at all events to conceal the matter from my wife, until further experience should discover to me the extent of this my unheard of calamity. Altering my countenance, therefore, in a moment, from its bepified and distorted appearance, to an expression of arch and coquettish benignity, I gave my lady a pat on the one cheek, and a kiss on the other, and without saying one syllable, furies I could not, left her astonished at my drollery, as I pirouette out of the room in a pas de zephyr. Behold me then safely ensconced in my private boudoir, a fearful instance of the ill consequences attending upon irascibility alive, with the qualifications of the dead, with the propensities of the living, an anomaly on the face of the earth, being very calm, yet breathless. Yes, breathless. I am serious in asserting that my breath was entirely gone. I could not have stirred with it a feather if my life had been at issue, or sullied even the delicacy of a mirror. Hard fate! Yet there was some alleviation to the first overwhelming paroxysm of my sorrow. I found, upon trial, that the powers of utterance which, upon my inability to proceed in the conversation with my wife, I then concluded to be totally destroyed, were in fact only partially impeded, and I discovered that had I, at that interesting crisis, dropped my voice to a singularly deep guttural, I might still have continued to her the communication of my sentiments, this pitch of voice, the guttural, depending, I find, not upon the current of the breath, but upon a certain spasmodic action of the muscles of the throat. Throwing myself upon a chair, I remained for some time absorbed in meditation. My reflections, be sure, were of no consolatory kind. 1,000 vague and lachrymatary fancies took possession of my soul, and even the idea of suicide flitted across my brain, but it is a trait in the poor versity of human nature to reject the obvious and the ready, for the far distant and equivocal. Thus I shuddered at self-murder as the most decided of atrocities, while the tabby cat purred strenuously upon the rug, and the very water-dog wheezed assiduously under the table, each taking to itself much merit for the strength of its lungs, and all obviously done in derision of my own pulmonary incapacity. Oppressed with a tumult of vague hopes and fears, I at length heard the footsteps of my wife descending the staircase. Being now assured of her absence, I returned with a palpitating heart to the scene of my disaster. Carefully locking the door on the inside, I commenced a vigorous search. It was possible, I thought, that, concealed in some obscure corner, or lurking in some closet or drawer, might be found the lost object of my inquiry. It might have a vapory, it might even have a tangible form. Most philosophers, upon many points of philosophy, are still very unphilosophical. William Godwin, however, says in his Mandeville, that flown visible things are the only realities, and this, all will yo, is a case in point. I would have the judicious reader pause before accusing such asseverations of an undue quantum of absurdity. Anaxagoras, it will be remembered, maintained that snow is black, and this I have since found to be the case. Long and earnestly did I continue the investigation, but the contemptible reward of my industry and perseverance proved to be only a set of false teeth, 2 pair of hips, an eye, and a number of billets due from Mr. Wind enough to my wife. I might as well here observe that this confirmation of my lady's partiality for Mr. W. occasioned me little uneasiness. That Mrs. Lackobreath should admire anything so dissimilar to myself was a natural and necessary evil. I am, it is well known, of a robust and corpulent appearance, and at the same time somewhat diminutive in stature. What wonder, then, that the lath-like tenuity of my acquaintance, and his altitude, which has grown into a proverb, should have met with all due estimation in the eyes of Mrs. Lack o' breath. But to return. My exertions, as I have before said, proved fruitless. Closet after closet, drawer after drawer, corner after corner were scrutinized to no purpose. At one time, however, I thought myself sure of my prize, having, in rummaging a dressing case, accidentally demolished a bottle of Grandjean's oil of archangels, which, as an agreeable perfume, I here take the liberty of recommending. With a heavy heart I returned to my boudoir, there to ponder upon some method of eluding my wife's penetration, until I could make arrangements prior to my leaving the country, for to this I had already made up my mind. In a foreign climate, being unknown, I might, with some probability of success, endeavor to conceal my unhappy calamity, a calamity calculated, even more than beggary, to estrange the affections of the multitude, and to draw down upon the wretch the well-merited indignation of the virtuous and the happy. I was not long in hesitation. Being naturally quick, I committed to memory the entire tragedy of Metamora. I had the good fortune to recollect that in the accentuation of this drama, or at least of such portion of it as is allotted to the hero, the tones of voice in which I found myself deficient were altogether unnecessary, and that the deep guttural was expected to reign monotonously throughout. I practiced for some time by the borders of a well-frequented marsh, herein, however, having no reference to a similar proceeding of Demosthenes, but from a design peculiarly and conscientiously my own. Thus armed at all points, I determined to make my wife believe that I was suddenly smitten with a passion for the stage. In this, I succeeded to a miracle, and to every question or suggestion found myself at liberty to reply in my most frog-like and sepulchral tones with some passage from the tragedy, any portion of which, as I soon took great pleasure in observing, would apply equally well to any particular subject. It is not to be supposed, however, that in the delivery of such passages I was found at all deficient in the looking asquint, the showing my teeth, the work ing my kns, the shuffling my feet, or in any of those unmentionable graces which are now justly considered the characteristics of a popular performer. To be sure, they spoke of confining me in a strait-jacket, but, good God, they never suspected me of having lost my breath. Having at length put my affairs in order, I took my seat very early one morning in the mail stage, for, giving it to be understood, among my acquaintances, that business of the last importance required my immediate personal attendance in that city. The coach was crammed to repletion, but in the uncertain twilight the features of my companions could not be distinguished. Without making any effectual resistance, I suffered myself to be placed between two gentlemen of colossal dimensions, while a third, of a size larger, requesting pardon for the liberty he was about to take, threw himself upon my body at full length, and falling asleep in an instant, drowned all my guttural ejaculations for relief, in a snore which would have put to blush the roarings of the bull of Fal Eris. Happily the state of my respiratory faculties rendered suffocation an accident entirely out of the question. As, however, the day broke more distinctly in our approach to the outskirts of the city, my tormentor, arising and adjusting his shirt collar, thanked me in a very friendly manner for my civility. Seeing that I remained motionless, all my limbs were dislocated and my head twisted on one side, his apprehensions began to be excited, and arousing the rest of the passengers, he communicated, in a very decided manner, his opinion that a dead man had been palmed upon them during the night for a living and responsible fellow traveler, here giving me a thump on the right eye, by way of demonstrating the truth of his suggestion. Hereupon all, one after another, there were 9 in company, believed it their duty to pull me by the ear. A young practicing physician, too, having applied a pocket mirror to my mouth, and found me without breath, the assertion of my persecutor was pronounced a true bill, and the whole party expressed a determination to endure tamely no such impositions for the future, and to proceed no farther with any such carcasses. For the present, I was here, accordingly, thrown out at the sign of the Crow, by which tavern the coach happened to be passing, without meeting with any further accident than the breaking of both my arms, under the left hind wheel of the vehicle. I must besides do the driver the justice to state that he did not forget to throw after me the largest of my trunks, which, unfortunately falling on my head, fractured my skull in a manner at once interesting and extraordinary. The landlord of the Crow, who is a hospitable man, finding that my trunk contained sufficient to indemnify him for any little trouble he might take in my behalf, sent forthwith for a surgeon of his acquaintance, and delivered me to his care with a bill and receipt for $10. The purchaser took me to his apartments and commenced operations. Immediately. Having cut off my ears, however, he discovered signs of animation. He now rang the bell, and sent for a neighboring apothecary with whom to consult in the emergency. In case of his suspicions with regard to my existence proving ultimately correct, he, in the meantime, made an incision in my stomach, and removed several of my viscera for private dissection. The apothecary had an idea that I was actually dead. This idea I endeavored to confute, kicking and plunging with all my might, and making the most furious contortions, for the operations of the surgeon had, in a measure, restored me to the possession of my faculties. All, however, was attributed to the effects of a new galvanic battery, wherewith the apothecary, who is really a man of information, performed several curious experiments, in which, from my personal share in their fulfillment, I could not help feeling deeply interested. It was a source of mortification to me nevertheless, that although I made several attempts at conversation, my powers of speech were so entirely in abeyance, that I could not even open my mouth, much less, then, make reply to some ingenious but fanciful theories of which, under other circumstances, my minute acquaintance with the Hippocratian pathology would have afforded me a ready confutation. Not being able to arrive at a conclusion, the practitioners remanded me for further examination. I was taken up into a garret, and the surgeon's lady having accommodated me with drawers and stockings, the surgeon himself fastened my hands, and tied up my jaws with a pocket handkerchief, then bolted the door on the outside as he hurried to his dinner, leaving me alone to silence and to meditation. I now discovered to my extreme delight that I could have spoken had not my mouth been tied up with the pocket handkerchief. Consoling myself with this reflection, I was mentally repeating some passages of the omnipresence of the deity, as is my custom before resigning myself to sleep, when two cats, of a greedy and vituperative turn, entering at a hole in the wall, leaped up with a flourish a la Catalani, and alighting opposite one another on my visage, betook themselves to indecorous contention for the paltry consideration of my nose. But, as the loss of his ears proved the means of elevating to the throne of Cyrus, the Magian, or Michgush of Persia, and as the cutting off his nose gave Zopyrus possession of Babylon, so the loss of a few ounces of my countenance proved the salvation of my body. Aroused by the pain, and burning with indignation, I burst, at a single effort, the fastenings and the bandage. Stalking across the room, I cast a glance of contempt at the belligerents, and throwing open the sash to their extreme horror and disappointment, precipitated myself, very dexterously, from the window. The male robber W, to whom I bore a singular resemblance, was at this moment passing from the city jail to the scaffold erected for his execution in the suburbs. His extreme infirmity and long-continued ill health had obtained him the privilege of remaining unmanacled, and habited in his gallows costume, one very similar to my own. He lay at full length in the bottom of the hangman's cart, which happened to be under the windows of the surgeon at the moment of my precipitation, without any other guard than the driver, who was asleep, and two recruits of the 6th Infantry, who were drunk. As ill luck would have it, I alit upon my feet within the vehicle. W, who was an acute fellow, perceived his opportunity. Leaping up immediately, he bolted out behind, and turning down an alley, was out of sight in the twinkling of an eye. The recruits, aroused by the bustle, could not exactly comprehend the merits of the transaction. Seeing, however, a man, the precise counterpart of the felon, standing upright in the cart before their eyes, they were of the opinion that the rascal, meaning W, was after making his escape, so they expressed themselves, and, having communicated this opinion to one another, they took each a dram, and then knocked me down with the butt ends of their muskets. It was not long ere we arrived at the place of destination. Of course nothing could be said in my defense. Hanging was my inevitable fate. I resigned myself thereto with a feeling half stupid, half acrimonious. Being little of a cynic, I had all the sentiments of a dog. The hangman, however, adjusted the noose about my neck. The drop fell. I forbear to depict my sensations upon the gallows, although here, undoubtedly, I could speak to the point, and it is a topic upon which nothing has been well said. In fact, to write upon such a theme it is necessary to have been hanged. Every author should confine himself to matters of experience. Thus Mark Antony composed a treatise upon getting drunk. I may just mention, however, that I did not. My body was, but I had no breath to be suspended, and but for the knot under my left ear, which had the feel of a military stock, I dare say that I should have experienced very little inconvenience. As for the jerk given to my neck upon the falling of the drop, it merely proved a corrective to the twist afforded me by the fat gentleman in the coach. For good reasons, however, I did my best to give the crowd the worth of their trouble. My convulsions were said to be extraordinary. My spasms it would have been difficult to beat. The populace encored. Several gentlemen swooned, and a multitude of ladies were carried home in hysterics. Pinxit availed himself of the opportunity to retouch, from a sketch taken upon the spot, his admirable painting of the Marseillaise flayed alive. When I had afforded sufficient amusement, it was thought proper to remove my body from the gallows, this the more especially as the real culprit had in the meantime been retaken and recognized, a fact which I was so unlucky as not to know. Much sympathy was, of course, exercised in my behalf, and as no one made claim to my corpse, it was ordered that I should be interred in a public vault. Here, after due interval, I was deposited. The sexton departed, and I was left alone. A line of Marston's malcontent death's a good fellow and keeps open house struck me at that moment as a palpable lie. I knocked off, however, the lid of my coffin, and stepped out. The place was dreadfully dreary and damp, and I became troubled with ennui. By way of amusement, I felt my way among the numerous coffins ranged in order around. I lifted them down, one by one, and breaking open their lids, busied myself in speculations about the mortality within. This, I soliloquized, tumbling over a carcass, puffy, bloated, and rotund, this has been, no doubt, in every sense of the word, an unhappy and unfortunate man. It has been his terrible lot not to walk but to waddle, to pass through life not like a human being, but like an elephant, not like a man, but like a rhinoceros. His attempts at getting on have been mere abortions, and his circumgyratory proceedings a palpable failure. Taking a step forward, it has been his misfortune to take 2 toward the right, and 3 toward the left. His studies have been confined to the poetry of Crabbe. He can have no idea of the wonder of a pirouette. To him a pas de Papillon has been an abstract conception. He has never ascended the summit of a hill. He has never viewed from any steeple the glories of a metropolis. Heat has been his mortal enemy. In the dog days his days have been the days of a dog. Therein, he has dreamed of flames and suffocation, of mountains upon mountains, of Pelion upon Ossa. He was short of breath, to say all in a word, he was short of breath. He thought it extravagant to play upon wind instruments. He was the inventor of self-moving fans, wind sails, and ventilators. He patronized Dupont the bellows maker, and died miserably in attempting to smoke a cigar. His was a case in which I feel a deep interest, a lot in which I sincerely sympathize. But here, said I here, and I dragged spitefully from its receptacle a gaunt, tall, and peculiar-looking form, whose remarkable appearance struck me with a sense of unwelcome familiarity. Here is a wretch entitled to no earthly commiseration. Thus saying, in order to obtain a More distinct view of my subject, I applied my thumb and forefinger to its nose, and causing it to assume a sitting position upon the ground, held it thus, at the length of my arm, while I continued my soliloquy. Entitled, I repeated, to no earthly commiseration. Who indeed would think of compassionating a shadow? Besides, has he not had his full share of the blessings of mortality? He was the originator of tale monuments, shot towers, lightning rods, Lombardy poplars. His treatise upon shades and shadows has immortalized him. He edited with distinguished ability the last edition of South on the Bones. He went early to college and studied pneumatics. He then came home, talked eternally, and played upon the French horn. He patronized the bagpipes. Captain Barclay, who walked against time, would not walk against him. Wyndham and Albrecht were his favorite writers, his favorite artist, Phys. He died gloriously while inhaling gas levici fiat corrupitur, like the Jamapudicit in Hieron Threnius. He was indubitably a how can you? How can you? Interrupted the object of my animadversions, gasping for breath, and tearing off, with a desperate exertion, the bandage around its jaws. How can you, Mr. Lack o' breath, be so infernally cruel as to pinch me in that manner by the nose? Did you not see how they had fastened up my mouth? And you must know, if you know anything, how vast a superfluity of breath I have to dispose of. If you do not know, however, sit down and you shall see. In my situation it is really a great relief to be able to open one's mouth, to be able to expatiate, to be able to communicate with a person like yourself, who do not think yourself called upon at every period to interrupt the thread of a gentleman's discourse. Interruptions are annoying and should undoubtedly be abolished, don't you think so? No reply, I beg you, one person is enough to be speaking at a time. I shall be done by and then you may begin. How the devil, sir, did you get into this place? Not a word, I beseech you. Been here some time myself. Terrible accident. Heard of it, I suppose? Awful calamity. Walking under your windows some short while ago, about the time you were stage struck. Horrible occurrence. Heard of catching one's breath, eh? Hold your tongue, I tell you. I caught somebody else's. Had always too much of my own. Met blab at the corner of the street, wouldn't give me a chance for a word, couldn't get in a syllable. Edgeways attacked, consequently, with epilepsis. Blab made his escape. Damn all fools. They took me up for dead, and put me in this place. Pretty doings all of them. Heard all you said about me, every word a lie. Horrible. Wonderful. Outrageous. Hideous. Incomprehensible. Etc. 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 It is impossible to conceive my astonishment at so unexpected a discourse, or the joy with which I became gradually convinced that the breath so fortunately caught by the gentleman, whom I soon recognized as my neighbor Wyndham, was, in fact, the identical expiration Miss Tenera residential in feminized Jamapudicitigraph et quasi flos pulcherim, cito ad levem marced oram, levici fiat corrupitur, maxime, etc. Hieronymus ad Salvinium. Laid by myself in the conversation with my wife. Time, place, and circumstance rendered it a matter beyond question. I did not, however, immediately release my hold upon Mr. W.'s proboscis, not at least during the long period in which the inventor of Lombardy poplars continued to favor me with his explanations. In this respect I was actuated by that habitual prudence which has ever been my predominating trait. I reflected that many difficulties might still lie in the path of my preservation, which only extreme exertion on my part would be able to surmount. Many persons, I considered, are prone to estimate commodities in their possession, however valueless to the then proprietor, however troublesome, or distressing, in direct ratio with the advantages to be derived by others from their attainment, or by themselves from their abandonment. Might not this be the case with Mr. Wyndham? In displaying anxiety for the breath of which he was at present so willing to get rid, might I not lay myself open to the exactions of his avarice? There are scoundrels in this world, I remembered with a sigh, who will not scruple to take unfair opportunities with even a next door neighbor, and, this remark is from Epictetus, it is precisely at that time when men are most anxious to throw off the burden of their own calamities that they feel the least desirous of relieving them in others. Upon considerations similar to these, and still retaining my grasp upon the nose of Mr. W., I accordingly thought proper to model my reply. Monster 1, I began in a tone of the deepest indignation. Monster and double-winded idiot! Dost thou, whom for thine iniquities it has pleased Heaven to accurse with a twofold respiration, dost thou, I say, presume to address me in the familiar language of an old acquaintance? Lie forsooth! And hold my tongue, to be sure. Pretty conversation indeed, to a gentleman with a single breath. All this, too, when I have it in my power to relieve the calamity under which thou dost so justly suffer, to curtail the superfluities of thine unhappy respiration. Like Brutus, I paused for a reply with which, like a tornado, Mr. Wind enough immediately overwhelmed me. Protestation followed upon protestation, and apology upon apology. There were no terms with which he was unwilling to comply, and there were none of which I failed to take the fullest advantage. Preliminaries being at length arranged, my acquaintance delivered me the respiration, for which, having carefully examined it, I gave him afterward a receipt. I am aware that by many I shall be held to blame for speaking, in a manner so cursory, of a transaction so impalpable. It will be thought that I should have entered more minutely into the details of an occurrence by which, and this is very true, much new light might be thrown upon a highly interesting branch of physical philosophy. To all this I am sorry that I cannot reply. A hint is the only answer which I am permitted to make. There were circumstances, but I think it much safer upon consideration to say as little as possible about an affair so delicate I repeat, and at the time involving the interests of a third party whose sulphurous resentment I have not the least desire, at this moment, of incurring. We were not long after this necessary arrangement in effecting an escape from the dungeons of the sepulchre. The united strength of our resuscitated voices was soon sufficiently apparent. Scissors, the Whig editor, republished a treatise upon the nature and origin of subterranean noises. A reply, rejoinder, confutation and justification followed in the columns of a democratic gazette. It was not until the opening of the vault to decide the controversy, that the appearance of Mr. Wind enough and myself proved both parties to have been decidedly in the wrong. I cannot conclude these details of some very singular passages in a life at all times sufficiently eventful, without again recalling to the attention of the reader the merits of that indiscriminate philosophy which is a sure and ready shield against those shafts of calamity which can neither be seen, felt, nor fully understood. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, among the ancient Hebrews, it was believed the gates of heaven would be inevitably opened to that sinner, or saint, who, with good lungs and implicit confidence, should vociferate the word Amen. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, when a great plague raged at Athens, and every means had been in vain attempted for its removal, Epimenides, as Laertius relates, in his second book, of that philosopher, advised the erection of a shrine and temple to the proper god. Littleton Berry. A tale of the late Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign plus EJ plures, mes u%, et fondes vous no. L'amoit u de ma vie miss votre au tombeau, corne I cannot just now remember when or where. First made the acquaintance of that truly fine-looking fellow, Brevet Brigadier General John A. B. C. Smith. Someone did introduce me to the gentleman, I am sure at some public meeting, I know very well held about something of great importance, no doubt at some place or other, I feel convinced, whose name I have unaccountably forgotten. The truth is that the introduction was attended, upon my part, with a degree of anxious embarrassment which operated to prevent any definite impressions of either time or place. I am constitutionally nervous. This, with me, is a family failing, and I can't help it. In especial, the slightest appearance of mystery of any point I cannot exactly comprehend puts me at once into a pitiable state of agitation. There was something, as it were, remarkable, yes, remarkable, although this is but a feeble term to express my full meaning about the entire individuality of the personage in question. He was, perhaps, 6 feet in height, and of a presence singularly commanding. There was an air distinctly pervading the whole man, which spoke of high breeding, and hinted at high birth. Upon this topic, the topic of Smithy's personal appearance, have a kind of melancholy satisfaction in being minute. His head of hair would have done honor to a Brutus, nothing could be more richly flowing, or possess a brighter gloss. It was of a jetty black, which was also the color, or more properly the no color, of his unimaginable whiskers. You perceive I cannot speak of these latter without enthusiasm. It is not too much to say that they were the handsomest pair of whiskers under the sun. At all events, they encircled, and at times partially overshadowed, a mouth utterly unequaled. Here were the most entirely even, and the most brilliantly white of all conceivable teeth. From between them, upon every proper occasion, issued a voice of surpassing clearness, melody, and strength. In the matter of eyes, also, my acquaintance was preeminently endowed. Either one of such a pair was worth a couple of the ordinary ocular organs. They were of a deep hazel, exceedingly large and lustrous, and there was perceptible about them, ever and anon, just that amount of interesting obliquity which gives pregnancy to expression. The bust of the general was unquestionably the finest bust I ever w. For your life you could not have found a fault with its wonderful proportion. This rare peculiarity set off to great advantage a pair of shoulders which would have called up a blush of conscious inferiority into the countenance of the marble Apollo. I have a passion for fine shoulders, and may say that I never beheld them in perfection before. The arms altogether were admirably modelled. Nor were the lower limbs less superb. These were, indeed, the ne plus ultra of good legs. Every connoisseur in such matters admitted the legs to be good. There was neither too much flesh nor too little, neither rudeness nor fragility. I could not imagine a more graceful curve than that of the os femoris, and there was just that due gentle prominence in the rear of the fibula which goes to the conformation of a properly proportioned calf. I wish to God my young and talented friend Chippen Capino, the sculptor, had but seen the legs of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. But although men so absolutely fine-looking are neither as plenty as raisins or blackberries, still I could not bring myself to believe that the remarkable something to which I alluded just now, that the odd air of J.E. ne sais quoi which hung about my new acquaintance, lay altogether, or indeed at all, in the supreme excellence of his bodily endowments. Perhaps it might be traced to the manner, yet here again I could not pretend to be positive. There was a primness, not to say stiffness, in his carriage, a degree of measured and, if I may so express it, of rectangular precision attending his every movement, which, observed in a more diminutive figure, would have had the least little savour in the world of affectation, pomposity, or constraint, but which, noticed in a gentleman of his undoubted dimensions, was readily placed to the account of reserve, hauteur of a commendable sense, in short, of what is due to the dignity of colossal proportion. The kind friend who presented me to General Smith whispered in my ear some few words of comment upon the man. He was a remarkable man, a very remarkable man indeed, one of the most remarkable men of the age. He was an especial favourite, too, with the ladies, chiefly on account of his high reputation for courage. And that point he is unrivalled, indeed he is a perfect desperado, a downright fire-eater, and no mistake, said my friend, here dropping his voice excessively low, and thrilling me with the mystery of his tone. A downright fire-eater, and no mistake. Showed that, I should say, to some purpose, in the late tremendous swamp fight, away down south, with the Bugaboo and Kickapoo Indians. Here my friend opened his eyes to some extent. Bless my soul! Blood and thunder, and all that. Prodigies of valor. Heard of him, of course? You know he's the man alive. How do you do? Why, how are ye? Very glad to see ye, indeed, here interrupted the general himself, seizing my companion by the hand as he drew near, and bowing stiffly but profoundly, as I was presented. I then thought, and I think so still, that I never heard a clearer nor a stronger voice, nor beheld a finer set of teeth, but I must say that I was sorry for the interruption just at that moment, as, owing to the whispers and insinuations aforesaid, my interest had been greatly excited in the hero of the Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign. However, the delightfully luminous conversation of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith soon completely dissipated this chagrin. My friend leaving us immediately, we had quite a long tete-a-tete, and I was not only pleased but really instructed. I never heard a more fluent talker, or a man of greater general information. With becoming modesty, he forbore, nevertheless, to touch upon the theme I had just then most at heart, I mean the mysterious circumstances attending the Bugaboo War, and, on my own part, what I conceived to be a proper sense of delicacy forbade me to broach the subject, although, in truth, I was exceedingly tempted to do so. I perceived, too, that the gallant soldier preferred topics of philosophical interest, and that he delighted, especially, in commenting upon the rapid march of mechanical invention. Indeed, lead him where I would, this was a point to which he invariably came back. There is nothing at all like it, he would say, we are a wonderful people, and live in a wonderful age. Parachutes and railroads, man traps and spring guns. Our steamboats are upon every sea, and the Nassau balloon packet is about to run regular trips, fare either way only £20 sterling, between London and Timbuktu. And who shall calculate the immense influence upon social life, upon arts, upon commerce, upon literature, which will be the immediate result of the great principles of electromagnetics? Nor, is this all, let me assure you. There is really no end to the march of invention. The most wonderful, the most ingenious, and let me add, Mr. Thompson, I believe, is your name, let me add, I say the most useful, the most truly useful mechanical contrivances are daily springing up like mushrooms, if I may so express myself, or, more figuratively, like grasshoppers, like grass hoppers, Mr. Thompson, about us and around us. Thompson, to be sure, is not my name, but it is needless to say that I left General Smith with a heightened interest in the man, with an exalted opinion of his conversational powers, and a deep sense of the valuable privileges we enjoy in living in this age of mechanical invention. My curiosity, however, had not been altogether satisfied, and I resolved to prosecute immediate inquiry among my acquaintances touching the Brevet Brigadier General himself, and particularly respecting the tremendous events quorum pars magna fut, during the Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign. The first opportunity which presented itself, and which horresco regerens, I did not in the least scruple to seize, occurred at the church of the Reverend Dr. Drummumyup, where I found myself established. One Sunday, just at sermon time, not only in the pew, but by the side of that worthy and communicative little friend of mine, Miss Tabitha T., thus seated, I congratulated myself, and with much reason, upon the very flattering state of affairs. If any person knew anything about Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith, that person, it was clear to me, was Miss Tabitha T. We telegraphed a few signals and then commenced, sotto voce, a brisk tete-a-tete. Smith, said she, in reply to my very earnest inquiry, Smith. Why? Not General A.B.C.? Bless me, I thought you knew all about him. This is a wonderfully inventive age. Horrid affair that. A bloody set of wretches, those Kickapoos. Fought like a hero, prodigies of valor, immortal renown. Smith. Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Why, you know he's the man, here broke in Dr. Drummumyup, at the top of his voice, and with a thump that came near knocking the pulpit about our ears. Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, he cometh up and is cut down like a flower. I started to the extremity of the pew, and perceived by the animated looks of the divine, that the wrath which had nearly proved fatal to the pulpit had been excited by the whispers of the lady and myself. There was no help for it, so I submitted with a good grace, and listened, in all the martyrdom of dignified silence, to the balance of that very capital discourse. Next evening found me a somewhat late visitor at the Rantipole Theatre, where I felt sure of satisfying my curiosity at once, by merely stepping into the box of those exquisite specimens of affability and omniscience, the Misses Arabella and Miranda Conoscenti. That fine tragedian, Climax, was doing Lago to a very crowded house, and I experienced some little difficulty in making my wishes understood, especially as our box was next the slips, and completely overlooked the stage. "Smith," said Miss Arabella, as she at length comprehended the purport of my query, "Smith." "Why, not General John A.B.C. Smith?" inquired Miranda, musingly. "God bless me, did you ever behold a finer figure?" "Never, madam, but do tell me or so inimitable grace." "Never, upon my word. But pray, inform me or so just an appreciation of stage effect." 409 Madam, you or a more delicate sense of the true beauties of Shakespeare. Be so good as to look at that leg. The devil, and I turned again to her sister. "Smith," said she, "why, not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair that, wasn't it? Great wretches, those bugaboos, savage and so on, but we live in a wonderfully inventive age." Smith. "Oh yes. Great man. Perfect desperado. Immortal renown. Prodigies of valor. Never heard." This was given in a scream. "Bless my soul. Why, he's the man, Mandragora, nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep which thou outedst yesterday." Here roared out Climax just in my ear, and shaking his fist in my face all the time, in a way that I could recite stand, and I would nage. I left the Misses Conoscenti immediately, went behind the scenes forthwith, and gave the beggarly scoundrel such a thrashing as I trust he will remember till the day of his death. At the soiree of the lovely widow, Mrs. Kathleen O'Trump, I was confident that I should meet with no similar disappointment. Accordingly, I was no sooner seated at the card table, with my pretty hostess for a vis-vis, than I propounded those questions the solution of which had become a matter so essential to my peace. "Smith," said my partner, "why, not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair that, wasn't it? Diamonds, did you say? Terrible wretches, those kickapoos. We are playing whist, if you please, Mr. Tattle. However, this is the age of invention, most certainly the age, one may say the age par excellence. Speak French? Oh, quite a hero, perfect desperado. No hearts, Mr. Tattle. I don't believe it. Immortal renown and all that? Prodigies of valor. Never heard. Why, bless me, he's the man. Captain Man," here screamed some little feminine interloper from the farthest corner of the room. "Are you talking about Captain Man and the duel? Oh, I must hear. Do tell, go on, Mrs. O'Trump. Do now go on. And go on, Mrs. O'Trump did all about a certain Captain Man, who was either shot or hung, or should have been both shot and hung. Yes. Mrs. O'Trump," she went on, and I went off. There was no chance of hearing anything further that evening in regard to Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. Still I consoled myself with the reflection that the tide of ill luck would not run against me forever, and so determined to make a bold push for information at the rout of that bewitching little angel, the graceful Mrs. Pirouette. "Smith," said Mrs. P., as we twirled about together in a pot as Zephyr. "Smith. Why, not General John A.B.C. Dreadful business that of the bugaboos, wasn't it? Dreadful creatures, those Indians. Do turn out your toes. I really am ashamed of you, man of great courage, poor fell. Lo! But this is a wonderful age for invention. Oh dear me, I'm out of breath. Quite a desperado, prodigies of valor never heard. Can't believe it. I shall have to sit down and enlighten you, Smith. Why, he's the man. Manger pred, I tell you. Here bawled out Miss Bass Blue, as I led Mrs. Pirouette to a seat. Did ever anybody hear the like? It's man free, I say, and not at all by any means man tiende. Here Miss Bass Blue beckoned to me in a very peremptory manner, and I was obliged, to leave Mrs. P for the purpose of deciding a dispute touching the title of a certain poetical drama of Lord Byron's. Although I pronounced, with great promptness, that the true title was Mc Friday, and not by any means man free, yet when I returned to seek Mrs. Pirouette she was not to be discovered, and I made my retreat from the house in a very bitter spirit of animosity against the whole race of the Bass Blues. Matters had now assumed a really serious aspect, and I resolved to call at once upon my particular friend, Mr. Theodore Sinivet, for I knew that here at least I should get something like definite information. Smith, said he, in his well-known peculiar way of drawling out his syllables, Smith. Why, not General John ABC. Savage affair that with the Kickapoos, wasn't it? Say, don't you think so? Perfect desperate do great pity, pon my honor. Wonderfully inventive age. Prodigies of valor. By the by, did you ever hear about Captain Maan? Captain Man BDD. Said I, please to go on with your story. Hem. Oh well. Quite la même chose, as we say in France. Smith, et. Brigadier General John ABC? I say here Mr. S thought proper to put his finger to the side of his nose. I say, you don't mean to insinuate now, really, and truly, and conscientiously, that you don't know all about that affair of Smith's, as well as I do, et. Smith. John ABC? Why, bless me, he's the Mayan Jfr Sinivet, said I, imploringly, he the man in the mask. No, said he, looking wise, nor the man in the moo on. This reply I considered a pointed and positive insult, and so left the house at once in high dudgeon, with a firm resolve to call my friend, Mr. Sinivet, to a speedy account for his ungentlemanly conduct and ill-breeding. In the meantime, however, I had no notion of being thwarted touching the information I desired. There was one resource left me yet. I would go to the fountain-head. I would call forthwith upon the general himself, and demand, in explicit terms, a solution of this abominable piece of mystery. Here, at least, there should be no chance for equivocation. I would be plain, positive, peremptory, as short as pie crust, as concise as Tacitus or Montesquieu. It was early when I called, and the general was dressing, but I pleaded urgent business, and was shown at once into his bedroom by an old negro valet, who remained in attendance during my visit. As I entered the chamber, I looked about, of course, for the occupant, but did not immediately perceive him. There was a large and exceedingly odd-looking bundle of something which lay close by my feet on the floor, and, as I was not in the best humor in the world, I gave it a kick out of the way. Hem. Ahem. Rather civil that, I should say, said the bundle, in one of the smallest, and altogether the funniest little voices, between a squeak and a whistle, that I ever heard in all the days of my existence. Ahem, rather civil that, I should observe. I fairly shouted with terror, and made off, at a tangent, into the farthest extremity of the room. God bless me, my dear fellow, here again whistled the bundle. Why, what is the matter? I really believe you don't know me at all. What could I say to all this? What could I? I staggered into an armchair, and, with staring eyes and open mouth, awaited the solution of the wonder. Strange you shouldn't know me though, isn't it? Presently resqueaked the nondescript, which I now perceived was performing upon the floor some inexplicable evolution, very analogous to the drawing on of a stocking. There was only a single leg, however, apparent. Strange you shouldn't know me though, isn't it? Pompey, bring me that leg. Here Pompey handed the bundle a very capital cork leg, already dressed, which it screwed on in a trice, and then it stood up before my eyes. And a bloody action it was, continued the thing, as if in a soliloquy, but then one mustn't fight with the bugaboos and kickaboos, and think of coming off with a mere scratch. Pompey, I'll thank you now for that arm. Thomas, turning to me, is decidedly the best hand at a cork leg, but if you should ever want an arm, my dear fellow, you must really let me recommend you to Bishop. Here Pompey screwed on an arm. We had rather hot work of it, that you may say. Now, you dog, slip on my shoulders and bosom. Pettit makes the best shoulders, but for a bosom you will have to go to Ducrow. Bosom, said I. Pompey, will you never be ready with that wig? Scalping is a rough process, after all, but then you can procure such a capital scratch at de Elorme's, scratch. Now, you nigsy, my teeth. For a good set of these you had better go to Parmley's at once, high prices, but excellent work. I swallowed some very capital articles, though, when the big bugaboo rammed me down with the butt end of his rifle. Butt end, rammed down, my eye. Oh yes, by the by, my eye here, Pompey, you scamp, screw it in. Those kickapoos are not so very slow at a gouge, but he's a belied man. That Dr. Williams, after all, you can't imagine how well I see with the eyes of his make. I now began very clearly to perceive that the object before me was nothing more nor less than my new acquaintance, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. The manipulations of Pompey had made, I must confess, a very striking difference in the personal appearance of the man. The voice, however, still puzzled me no little, but even this apparent mystery was speedily cleared up. Pompey, you black rascal, squeaked the general, I really do believe you would let me go out without my pallet. Hereupon, the negro, grumbling out an apology, went up to his master, opened his mouth with the knowing air of a horse jockey, and adjusted therein a somewhat singular-looking machine, in a very dexterous manner, that I could not altogether comprehend. The alteration, however, in the entire expression of the general's countenance was instantaneous and surprising. When he again spoke, his voice had resumed all that rich melody and strength which I had noticed upon our original introduction. The vagabonds, said he, in so clear a tone that I positively started at the change, and the vagabonds, they not only knocked in the roof of my mouth, but took the trouble to cut off at least 7/8 of my tongue. There isn't Bonfanti's equal, however, in America, for really good articles of this description. I can recommend you to him with confidence. Here the general bowed and assure you that I have the greatest pleasure in so doing. I acknowledged his kindness in my best manner, and took leave of him. At once, with a perfect understanding of the true state of affairs, with a full comprehension of the mystery which had troubled me so long. It was evident. It was a clear case. Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith was the man that was used up. Method is the soul of business. Old saying, I am a businessman. I am a methodical man. Method is the thing, after all. But there are no people I more heartily despise than your eccentric fools who prate about method without understanding it, attending strictly to its letter, and violating its spirit. These fellows are always doing the most out of the way things in what they call an orderly manner. Now here, I conceive, is a positive paradox. True method appertains to the ordinary and the obvious alone, and cannot be applied to the outre. What definite idea can a body attach to such expressions as methodical Jack-o'-dandy, or a systematical will-o'-the-wisp? My notions upon this head might not have been so clear as they are, but for a fortunate accident which happened to me when I was a very little boy. A good-hearted old Irish nurse, whom I shall not forget in my will, took me up one day by the heels, when I was making more noise than was necessary, and swinging me round 2 or 3 times, my eyes for a squeaking little spalpeen, and then knocked my head into a cocked hat against the bedpost. This, I say, decided my fate, and made my fortune. A bump arose at once on my sinciput, and turned out to be as pretty an organ of order as one shall see on a summer's day. Hence that positive appetite for system and regularity which has made me the distinguished man of business that I am. If there is anything on earth I hate, it is a genius. Your geniuses are all arrant asses. The greater the genius the greater the ass, and to this rule there is no exception whatever. Especially, you cannot make a man of business out of a genius, any more than money out of a Jew, or the best nutmegs out of pine knots. The creatures are always going off at a tangent into some fantastic employment, or ridiculous speculation, entirely at variance with the fitness of things, and having no business whatever to be considered as a business at all. Thus you may tell these characters immediately by the nature of their occupations. If you ever perceive a man setting up as a merchant or a manufacturer, or going into the cotton or tobacco trade, or any of those eccentric pursuits, or getting to be a dry goods dealer, or soap boiler, or something of that kind, or pretending to be a lawyer, or a blacksmith, or a physician, anything out of the usual way, you may set him down at once as a genius, and then, according to the rule of three, he's an ass. Now I am not in any respect a genius, but a regular businessman. My daybook and ledger will evince this in a minute. They are well kept, though I say it myself, and, in my general habits of accuracy and punctuality, I am not to be beat by a clock. Moreover, my occupations have been always made to chime in with the ordinary habitudes of my fellow men. Not that I feel the least indebted, upon this score, to my exceedingly weak-minded parents, who, beyond doubt, would have made an arrant genius of me at last, if my guardian angel had not come, in good time, to the rescue. In biography the truth is everything, and in autobiography it is especially so, yet I scarcely hope to be believed when I state, however solemnly, that my poor father put me, when I was about 15 years of age, into the counting house of what he termed a respectable hardware and commission merchant, doing a capital bit of business, a capital bit of fiddlestick. However, the consequence of this folly was, that in 2 or 3 days, I had to be sent home to my button-headed family in a high state of fever, and with a most violent and dangerous pain in the sinciput. All round about my organ of order. It was nearly a gone case with me then, just touch and go for 6 weeks, the physicians giving me up and all that sort of thing. But, although I suffered much, I was a thankful boy in the main. I was saved from being a respectable hardware and commission merchant, doing a capital bit of business, and I felt grateful to the protuberance which had been the means of my salvation, as well as to the kind-hearted female who had originally put these means within my reach. The most of boys run away from home at 10 or 12 years of age, but I waited till I was 16. I don't know that I should have gone even then, if I had not happened to hear my old mother talk about setting me up on my own hook in the grocery way. The grocery way. Only think of that! I resolved to be off forthwith, and try and establish myself in some decent occupation, without dancing attendance any longer upon the caprices of these eccentric old people, and running the risk of being made a genius of in the end. In this project I succeeded perfectly well at the first effort, and by the time I was fairly 18, found myself doing an extensive and profitable business in the tailor's walking advertisement line. I was enabled to discharge the onerous duties of this profession, only by that rigid adherence to system which formed the leading feature of my mind. A scrupulous method characterized my actions as well as my accounts. In my case, it was method not money which made the man at least all of him that was not made by the tailor whom I served. At 9, every morning, I called upon that individual for the clothes of the day. 10 o'clock found me in some fashionable promenade or other place of public amusement. The precise regularity with which I turned my handsome person about, so as to bring successively into view every portion of the suit upon my back, was the admiration of all the knowing men in the trade. Noon never passed without my bringing home a customer to the house of my employers, Messrs. Cut and Come Again. I say this proudly, but with tears in my eyes, for the firm proved themselves the basest of ingrates. The little account, about which we quarreled and finally parted, cannot, in any item, be thought overcharged, by gentlemen really conversant with the nature of the business. Upon this point, however, I feel a degree of proud satisfaction in permitting the reader to judge for himself. My bill ran thus: Messrs. Cut and Come Again, Merchant Tailors, to Peter Prophet, Walking Advertiser, Drs. July 10th. To Promenade, as usual, and customer brought home, $002 July 2. To do July 25th 12. To One Lie, second class, damaged black cloth sold for invisible green, 2 July 5th 13. To One Lie, first class, extra quality and size, recommending milled satinette as broadcloth, 75 July 20th. To Purchasing brand new paper shirt collar or dicky, to set off Grey Petersham, August 2nd. 15. To Wearing double padded bobtail frock, thermometer 706 in the shade, 2 August 5th 16. Standing on one leg 3 hours, to show off new style strapped pants at I2J 4 cents per leg per hour, 37 4 August. 17. To Promenade, as usual, and large customer brought, fat man, 50 August 18th. To do, medium size, August 25th 19. To do, small man and bad pay, 6/9. The item chiefly disputed in this bill was the very moderate charge of 2 pennies for the dicky. Upon my word of honor, this was not an unreasonable price for that dicky. It was one of the cleanest and prettiest little dickies I ever saw, and I have good reason to believe that it effected the sale of 3 Petershams. The elder partner of the firm, however, would allow me only 1 penny of the charge, and took it upon himself to show in what manner 4 of the same sized conveniences could be got out of a sheet of foolscap. But it is needless to say that I stood upon the principle of the thing. Business is business, and should be done in a business way. There was no system whatever in swindling me out of a penny, a clear fraud of 50 per cent, no method in any respect. I left at once the EMPLO3NNENT of Messrs. Cut and Come Again, and set up in the eyesore line. By myself one of the most lucrative, respectable, and independent of the ordinary occupations. My strict integrity, economy, and rigorous business habits, here again came into play. I found myself driving a flourishing trade, and soon became a marked man upon change. The truth is, I never dabbled in flashy matters, but jogged on in the good old sober routine of the calling, a calling in which I should, no doubt, have remained to the present hour, but for a little accident which happened to me in the prosecution of one of the usual business operations of the profession. Whenever a rich old hunks, or prodigal heir, or bankrupt corporation gets into the notion of putting up a palace, there is no such thing in the world as stopping either of them, and this every intelligent person knows. The fact in question is indeed the basis of the eyesore trade. As soon, therefore, as a building project is fairly afoot by one of these parties, we merchants secure a nice corner of the lot in contemplation, or a prime little situation, just adjoining, or right in front. This done, we wait until the palace is halfway up, and then we pay some tasty architect to run us up an ornamental mud hovel, right against it, or a down east or Dutch pagoda, or a pigsty, or an ingenious little bit of fancy work, either Eskimo, Kickapoo, or Hottentot. Of course we can't afford to take these structures down under a bonus of 500%, upon the prime cost of our lot and plaster. Can we? I ask the question. I ask it of businessmen. It would be irrational to suppose that we can. And yet there was a rascally corporation which asked me to do this very thing. I did not reply to their absurd proposition, of course, but I felt it a duty to go that same night, and lamp black the whole of their palace. For this the unreasonable villains clapped me into jail, and the gentlemen of the eyesore trade could not well avoid cutting my connection when I came out. The assault and battery business, into which I was now forced to adventure for a livelihood, was somewhat ill adapted to the delicate nature of my constitution, but I went to work in it with a good heart, and found my account here, as heretofore, in those stern habits of methodical accuracy which had been thumped into me by that delightful old nurse. Would indeed be the basest of men not to remember her well in my will. By observing, as I say, the strictest system in all my dealings, and keeping a well-regulated set of books, I was enabled to get over many serious difficulties, and, in the end, to establish myself very decently in the profession. The truth is, that few individuals, in any line, did a snugger little business than I will just copy a page or so out of my day book, and this will save me the necessity of blowing my own trumpet, a contemptible practice of which no high-minded man will be guilty. Now, the day book is a thing that don't lie. January. I New Year's Day. Met Snap in the street, groggy. MEM. He'll do. Met Gruff shortly afterward, blind drunk. MEM he tl answer to. Entered both gentlemen in my ledger, and opened a running account with each. January 2. Saw Snap at the exchange, and went up and trod on his toe *, doubled his fist and knocked me down. Good. Got up again. Some trifling difficulty with Bag, my attorney. I want the damages at 1,000, but he says that for so simple a knockdown we can't lay them at more than 500. MEM must get rid of Bag, no system at all. January 3 went to the theater, to look for Gruff. Saw him sitting in a side box, in the second tier, between a fat lady and a lean one. Quizzed the whole party through an opera glass, till I saw the fat lady blush and whisper to G. Went round, then, into the box, and put my nose within reach of his hand. Wouldn't pull it, no go. Blew it, and tried again, no go. Sat down then, and winked at the lean lady, when I had the high satisfaction of finding him lift me up by the nape of the neck, and fling me over into the pit. Neck dislocated, and right leg capitally splintered. Went home in high glee, drank a bottle of champagne, and booked the young man for 5,000. Bag says it'll do. February 1-5 compromised the case of Mr. Snap. Amount entered in journal 50 cents, which see. February 16 cast by that ruffian, Gruff, who made me a present of $5. Costs of suit, $4.25. Net profit, see journal, 75 cents. Now, here is a clear gain, in a very brief period, of no less than $1.25. This is in the mere cases of Snap and Gruff, and I solemnly assure the reader that these extracts are taken at random from my day book. It's an old saying, and a true one, however, that money is nothing in comparison with health. I found the exactions of the profession somewhat too much for my delicate state of body, and, discovering, at last, that I was knocked all out of shape, so that I didn't know very well what to make of the matter, and so that my friends, when they met me in the street, couldn't tell that I was Peter Prophet at all, it occurred to me that the best expedient I could adopt was to alter my line of business. I turned my attention, therefore, to mud dabbling, and continued it for some years. The worst of this occupation is, that too many people take a fancy to it, and the competition is in consequence excessive. Every ignoramus of a fellow who finds that he hasn't brains in sufficient quantity to make his way as a walking advertiser, or an eyesore prig, or a salt and batter man, thinks, of course, that he'll answer very well as a dabbler of mud. But there never was entertained a more erroneous idea than that it requires no brains to mud dabble. Especially, there is nothing to be made in this way without method. I did only a retail business myself, but my old habits of system carried me swimmingly along. I selected my street crossing, in the first place, with great deliberation, and I never put down a broom in any part of the town but that, I took care, too, to have a nice little puddle at hand, which I could get at in a minute. By these means I got to be well known as a man to be trusted, and this is one half the battle, let me tell you, in trade. Nobody ever failed to pitch me a copper, and got over my crossing with a clean pair of pantaloons. and, as my business habits, in this respect, were sufficiently understood, I never met with any attempt at imposition. I wouldn't have put up with it, if I had. Never imposing upon any one myself, I suffered no one to play the possum with me. The frauds of the banks of course I couldn't help. Their suspension put me to ruinous inconvenience. These, however, are not individuals but corporations, and corporations, it is very well known, have neither bodies to be kicked nor souls to be damned. I was making money at this business when, in an evil moment, I was induced to merge in the curse-battering somewhat analogous, but, by no means, so respectable a profession. My location, to be sure, was an excellent one, being central, and I had capital blacking and brushes. My little dog, too, was quite fat and up to all varieties of snuff. He had been in the trade a long time, and, I may say, understood it. Our general routine was this: Pompey, having rolled himself well in the mud, sat upon end at the shop door, until he observed a dandy approaching in bright boots. He then proceeded to meet him, and gave the Wellingtons a rub or two with his wool. Then the dandy swore very much, and looked about for a bootblack. There I was, full in his view, with blacking and brushes. It was only a minute's work, and then came a sixpence. This did moderately well for a time. In fact, I was not avaricious, but my dog was. I allowed him a third of the profit, but he was advised to insist upon half. This I couldn't stand, so we quarreled and parted. I next tried my hand at the organ grinding for a while, and may say that I made out pretty well. It is a plain, straightforward business, and requires no particular abilities. You can get a music mill for a mere song, and to put it in order, you have but to open the works, and give them 3 or 4 smart raps with a hammer. It improves the tone of the thing, for business purposes, more than you can imagine. This done, you have only to stroll along, with the mill on your back, until you see tanbark in the street, and a knocker wrapped up in buckskin. Then you stop and grind, looking as if you meant to stop and grind till doomsday. Presently a window opens, and somebody pitches you a sixpence, with a request to hush up and go on, etc. I am aware that some grinders have actually afforded to go on for this sum, but for my part, I found the necessary outlay of capital too great to permit of my percentoing on under a shilling. At this occupation I did a good deal, but, somehow, I was not quite satisfied, and so finally abandoned it. The truth is, I labored under the disadvantage of having no monkey, and American streets are so muddy, and a democratic rabble is so obtrusive, and so full of demnition mischievous little boys. I was now out of employment for some months, but at length succeeded, by dint of great interest, in procuring a situation in the sham post. The duties, here, are simple, and not altogether unprofitable. For example, very early in the morning I had to make up my packet of sham letters. Upon the inside of each of these I had to scrawl a few lines on any subject which occurred to me as sufficiently mysterious, signing all the epistles Tom Dobson, or Bobby Tompkins, or anything in that way. Having folded and sealed all, and stamped them with sham postmarks, New Orleans, Bengal, Botany Bay, or any other place a great way off, I set out, forthwith, upon my daily route, as if in a very great hurry. I always called at the big houses to deliver the letters, and receive the postage. Nobody hesitates at paying for a letter, especially for a double one. People are such fools, and it was no trouble to get round a corner before there was time to open the epistles. The worst of this profession was, that I had to walk so much and so fast, and so frequently to vary my route. Besides, I had serious scruples of conscience. I can't bear to hear innocent individuals abused, and the way the whole town took to cursing Tom Dobson and Bobby Tompkins was really awful to hear. I washed my hands of the matter in disgust. My 8th and last speculation has been in the cat-growing way. I have found this a most pleasant and lucrative business, and, really, no trouble at all. The country, it is well known, has become infested with cats, so much so of late, that a petition for relief, most numerously and respectably signed, was brought before the legislature at its late memorable session. The assembly, at this epoch, was unusually well informed, and, having passed many other wise and wholesome enactments, it crowned all with the Cat Act. In its original form, this law offered a premium for dead heads, 4d. apiece, but the Senate succeeded in amending the main clause, so as to substitute the word for heads. This amendment was so obviously proper, that the House concurred in it nem. Con. As soon as the governor had signed the bill, I invested my whole estate in the purchase of toms and tabbies. At first I could only afford to feed them upon mice, which are cheap, but they fulfilled the scriptural injunction at so marvelous a rate, that I at length considered it my best policy to be liberal, and so indulged them in oysters and turtle. Their tails, at a legislative price, now bring me in a good income, for I have discovered a way, in which, by means of macassar oil, I can force 3 crops in a year. It delights me to find, too, that the animals soon get ac. 420 custom to the thing, and would rather have the appendages cut off than otherwise. I consider, myself, therefore, a made man, and am bargaining for a country seat on the Hudson. Perhaps no exhibition of the kind has ever elicited so general attention as the chess player of Maelzel. Wherever seen it has been an object of intense curiosity to all persons who think. Yet the question of its modus operandi is still undetermined. Nothing has been written on this topic which can be considered as decisive, and accordingly we find ever 3 enveyor men of mechanical genius, of great general acuteness and discriminative understanding, who make no scruple in pronouncing the automaton a pure machine unconnected with human agency in its movements, and, consequently, beyond all comparison, the most astonishing of the inventions of mankind. And such it would undoubtedly be, were they right in their supposition. Assuming this H5 hypothesis, it would be grossly absurd to compare with the chess player any similar thing of either modern or ancient days. Yet there have been many and wonderful automata. In Brewster's Letters on Natural Magic, we have an account of the most remarkable. Among these may be mentioned, as having beyond doubt existed, firstly, the coach invented by M. Camus for the amusement of Louis XIV. When a child, a table, about 4 feet square, was introduced into the room appropriated for the exhibition. Upon this table was placed a carriage 6 inches in length, made of wood, and drawn by 2 horses of the same material. One window being down, a lady was seen on the back seat. A coachman held the reins on the box, and a footman and page were in their places behind. M. Camus now touched a spring, whereupon the coachman smacked his whip, and the horses proceeded in a natural manner along the edge of the table, drawing after them the carriage. Having gone as far as possible in this direction, a sudden turn was made to the left, and the vehicle was driven at right angles to its former course, and still closely along the edge of the table. In this way the coach proceeded until it arrived opposite the chair of the young prince. It then stopped, the page descended and opened the door, the lady alighted and presented a petition to her sovereign. She then re-entered. The page put up the steps, closed the door, and resumed his station. The coachman whipped his horses, and the carriage was driven back to its original position. The magician of M. Maillardet is also worthy of notice. We copy the following account of it from the letters before mentioned of Dr. B., who derived his information principally from the Edinburgh Encyclopedia. One of the most popular pieces of mechanism which we have seen, is the magician constructed by M. Maillardet, for the purpose of answering certain given questions. A figure, dressed like a magician, appears seated at the bottom of a wall, holding a wand in one hand, and a book in the other. A number of questions, ready prepared, are inscribed on oval medallions, and the spectator takes any of these he chooses, and to which he wishes an answer, and having placed it in a drawer ready to receive it, the drawer shuts with a spring till the answer is returned. The magician then arises from his seat, bows his head, describes circles with his wand, and consulting the book as if in deep thought, he lifts it toward his face. Having thus appeared to ponder over the proposed question, he raises his wand, and striking with it the wall above his head, two folding doors fly open, and display an appropriate answer to the question. The doors again close, the magician resumes his original position, and the drawer opens to return the medallion. There are 20 of these medallions, all containing different questions, to which the magician returns the most suitable and striking answers. The medallions are thin plates of brass, of an elliptical form, exactly resembling each other. Some of the medallions have a question inscribed on each side, both of which the magician answers in succession. If the drawer is shut without a medallion being put in it, the magician rises, consults his book, shakes his head, and resumes his seat. The folding doors remain shut, and the drawer is returned empty. If two medallions are put into the drawer together, an answer is returned only to the lower one. When the machinery is wound up, the movements continue about an hour, during which time about 50 persons may be answered. The inventor stated that the means by which the different medallions acted upon the machinery, so as to produce the proper answers to the questions which they contained, were extremely simple. The duck of Vaucanson was still more remarkable. It was of the size of life, and so perfect an imitation of the living animal that all the spectators were deceived. It executed, says Brewster, all the natural movements and gestures, it ate and drank with avidity, performed all the quick motions of the head and throat which are peculiar to the duck, and like it, muddled the water which it drank with its bill. It produced also the sound of quacking in the most natural manner. In the anatomical structure the artists exhibited the highest skill. Every bone in the real duck had its representative in the automaton, and its wings were anatomically exact. Every cavity, apophysis, and curvature was imitated, and each bone executed its proper movements. When corn was thrown down before it, the duck stretched out its neck to pick it up, swallowed, and digested it. But if these machines were ingenious, what shall we think of the calculating machine of Mr. Babbage? What shall we think of an engine of wood and metal which can not only compute astronomical and navigation under the head and raids? In the Edinburgh Encyclopedia may be found a few account of the principal automata of ancient and modern times. Tables to any given extent, but render the exactitude of its operations mathematically certain through its power of correcting its possible errors. What shall we think of a machine which can not only accomplish all this, but actually print off its elaborate results, when obtained, without the slightest intervention of the intellect of man? It will, perhaps, be said in reply, that a machine such as we have described is altogether above comparison with the chess player of Maelzel. By no means it is altogether beneath it, that is to say, provided we assume, what should never for a moment be assumed, that the chess player is a pure machine, and performs its operations without any immediate human agency. Arithmetical or algebraical calculations are, from their very nature, fixed and determinate. Certain data being given, certain results necessarily and inevitably follow. These results have dependence upon nothing, and are influenced by nothing but the data originally given. And the question to be solved proceeds, or should proceed, to its final determination, by a succession of unerring steps liable to no change, and subject to no modification. This being the case, we can without difficulty conceive the possibility of so arranging a piece of mechanism, that upon starting it in accordance with the data of the question to be solved, it should continue its movements regularly, progressively, and undeviatingly toward the required solution, since these movements, however complex, are never imagined to be otherwise than finite and determinate. But the case is widely different with the chess player. With him there is no determinate progression. No one move in chess necessarily follows upon any one other. From no particular disposition of the men at one period of a game can we predicate their disposition at a different period. Let us place the first if-Yov in a game of chess, in juxtaposition with the data of an algebraical question, and their great difference will be immediately perceived. From the latter, from the data, the second step of the question, dependent thereupon, inevitably follows. It is modeled by the data. It must be thus and not otherwise. But from the first move in the game of chess no especial second move follows of necessity. In the algebraical question, as it proceeds toward solution, the certainty of its operations remains altogether unimpaired. The second step having been a consequence of the data, the third step is equally a consequence of the second, the fourth of the third, the fifth of the fourth, and so on, and not possibly otherwise, to the end. But in proportion to the progress made in a game of chess, is the uncertainty of each ensuing move. A few moves having been made, no step is certain. Different spectators of the game would advise different moves. All is then dependent upon the variable judgment of the players. Now, even granting, what should not be granted, that the movements of the automaton chess player were in themselves determinate, they would be necessarily interrupted and disarranged by the indeterminate will of his antagonist. There is then no analogy whatever between the operations of the chess player, and those of the calculating machine of Mr. Babbage, and if we choose to call the former a pure machine, we must be prepared to admit that it is, beyond all comparison, the most wonderful of the inventions of mankind. Its original projector, however, Baron Kemp-Elin, had no scruple in declaring it to be a very ordinary piece of mechanism, a bagatelle whose effects appeared so marvelous only from the boldness of the conception, and the fortunate choice of the methods adopted for promoting the illusion. But it is needless to dwell upon this point. It is quite certain that the operations of the automaton are regulated by Mindy and by nothing else. Indeed, this matter is susceptible of a mathematical demonstration, a priori. The only question then is of the manner in which human agency is brought to bear. Before entering upon this subject, it would be as well to give a brief history and description of the chess player for the benefit of such of our readers as may never have had an opportunity of witnessing Mr. Maleseff's exhibition. The automaton chess player was invented in 1769 by Baron Kemp-Elin, a nobleman of Pressburg, in Hungary, who afterward disposed of it, together with the secret of its operations, to its present possessor. Soon after its completion it was exhibited in Pressburg, Paris, Vienna, and other continental cities. In 1783 and 1784 it was taken to London by Mr. Maelzel. Of late years it has visited the principal towns in the United States. Wherever seen, the most intense curiosity was excited by its appearance, and numerous have been the attempts, by men of all classes, to fathom the mystery of its evolutions. The cut on this page gives a tolerable representation of the figure as seen by the citizens of Richmond a few weeks ago. The right arm, however, should lie more at length upon the box, a chessboard should appear upon it, and the cushion should not be seen while the pipe is held. Some immaterial alterations have been made in the costume of the player since it came into the possession of Maelzel. The plume, for example, was not originally worn. This was written in $183, when Mr. Maelzel, recently deceased, was exhibiting the chess player in the United States. It is now, 1855, we believe, in the possession of Prof. J. K. Mitchell, M.D., of Philadelphia. Editor. At the hour appointed for exhibition, a curtain is withdrawn, or folding doors are thrown open, and the machine rolled to within about 12 feet of the nearest of the spectators, between whom and it, the machine, a rope is stretched. A figure is seen habited as a Turk, and seated, with its legs crossed, at a large box apparently of maple wood, which serves it as a table. The exhibitor will, if requested, roll the machine to any portion of the room, suffer it to remain altogether on any designated spot, or even shift its location repeatedly during the progress of a game. The bottom of the box is elevated considerably above the floor by means of the casters or brazen rollers on which it moves, a clear view of the surface immediately beneath the automaton being thus afforded to the spectators. The chair on which the figure sits is affixed permanently to the box. On the top of this latter is a chessboard, also permanently affixed. The right arm of the chess player is extended at full length before him, at right angles with his body, and lying, in an apparently careless position, by the side of the board. The back of the hand is upward. The board itself is 18 inches square. The left arm of the figure is bent at the elbow, and in the left hand is a pipe. A green drapery conceals the back of the Turk, and falls partially over the front of both shoulders. To judge from the external appearance of the box, it is divided into 5 compartments, 3 cupboards of equal dimensions and 2 drawers occupying that portion of the chest lying beneath the cupboards. The foregoing observations apply to the appearance of the automaton upon its first introduction into the presence of the spectators. Maelzel now informs the company that he will disclose to their view the mechanism of the machine. Taking from his pocket a bunch of keys, he unlocks with one of them a door marked I in the cut on page 424, and throws the cupboard fully open to the inspection of all present. Its whole interior is apparently filled with wheels, pinions, levers, and other machinery, crowded very closely together, so that the eye can penetrate but a little distance into the mass. Leaving this door open to its full extent, he goes now round to the back of the box, and raising the drapery of the figure, opens another door situated precisely in the rear of the one first opened. Holding a lighted candle at this door, and shifting the position of the whole machine repeatedly at the same time, a bright light is thrown entirely through the cupboard, which is now clearly seen to be full, completely full, of machinery. The spectators being satisfied of this fact, Maelzel closes the back door, locks it, takes the key from the lock, lets fall the drapery of the figure, and comes round to the front. The door marked I, it will be remembered, is still open. The exhibitor now proceeds to open the drawer which lies beneath the cupboards at the bottom of the box, for although there are apparently 2 drawers, there is really only one, the 2 handles and 2 keyholes being intended merely for ornament. Having opened this drawer to its full extent, a small cushion, and a set of chessmen, fixed in a framework made to support them perpendicularly, are discovered. Leaving this drawer, as well as cupboard No. I, open, Maelzel now unlocks door number 2, and door number 3, which are discovered to be folding doors, opening into one and the same compartment. To the right of this compartment, however, that is to say to the spectator's right, a small division, 6 inches wide, and filled with machinery, is partitioned off. The main compartment itself, in speaking of that portion of the box visible upon opening doors 2 and 3, we shall always call it the main compartment, is lined with dark cloth and contains no machinery whatever beyond 2 pieces of steel, quadrant-shaped, and situated one in each of the rear top corners of the compartment. A small protuberance about 8 inches square, and also covered with dark cloth, lies on the floor of the compartment near the rear corner on the spectator's left hand. Leaving doors number 2 and number 3 open, as well as the drawer and door No. I, the exhibitor now goes round to the back of the main compartment, and, unlocking another door there, displays clearly all the interior of the main compartment, by introducing a candle behind it and within it. The whole box being thus apparently disclosed to the scrutiny of the company, Maelzel, still leaving the doors and drawer open, rolls the automaton entirely round, and exposes the back of the Turk by lifting up the drapery. A door about 10 inches square is thrown open in the loins of the figure, and a smaller one also in the left thigh. The interior of the figure, as seen through these apertures, appears to be crowded with machinery. In general, every spectator is now thoroughly satisfied of having beheld and completely scrutinized, at one and the same time, every individual portion of the automaton, and the idea of any person being concealed in the interior, during so complete an exhibition of that interior, if ever entertained, is immediately dismissed as preposterous in the extreme. Maelzel, having rolled the machine back into its original position, now informs the company that the automaton will play a game of chess with anyone disposed to encounter him. This challenge being accepted, a small table is prepared for the antagonist, and placed close by the rope, but on the spectator's side of it, and so situated as not to prevent the company from obtaining a full view of the automaton. From a drawer in this table is taken a set of chessmen, and Maelzel arranges them generally, but not always, with his own hands, on the chessboard, which consists merely of the usual number of squares painted upon the table. The antagonist having taken his seat, the exhibitor approaches the drawer of the box, and takes therefrom the cushion, which, after removing the pipe from the hand of the automaton, he places under its left arm as a support. Then taking also from the drawer the automaton's set of chessmen, he arranges them upon the chessboard before the figure. He now proceeds to close the doors and to lock them, leaving the bunch of keys in door no I. He also closes the drawer, and, finally, winds up the machine, by applying a key to an aperture in the left end, the spectator's left, of the box. The game now commences, the automaton taking the first move. The duration of the contest is usually limited to half an hour, but if it be not finished at the expiration of this period, and the antagonist still contends that he can beat the automaton, Maelzel has seldom any objection to continue it. Not to weary the company is the ostensible and no doubt the real object of the limitation. It will of course be understood that when a move is made at his own table, by the antagonist, the corresponding move is made at the box of the automaton, by Maelzel himself, who then acts as the representative of the antagonist. On the other hand, when the Turk moves, the corresponding move is made at the table of the antagonist, also by Maelzel, who then acts as the representative of the automaton. In this manner it is necessary that the exhibitor should often pass from one table to the other. He also frequently goes in the rear of the figure to remove the chessmen which it has taken, and which it deposits, when taken, on the box to the left, to its own left, of the board. When the automaton hesitates in relation to its move, the exhibitor is occasionally seen to place himself very near its right side, and to lay his hand now and then, in a careless manner, upon the box. He has also a peculiar shuffle with his feet, calculated to induce suspicion of collusion with the machine in minds which are more cunning than sagacious. These peculiarities are, no doubt, mere mannerisms of Maelzel, or, if he is aware of them at all, he puts them in practice with a view of exciting in the spectators a false idea of the pure mechanism in the automaton. The Turk plays with his left hand. All the movements of the arm are at right angles. In this manner, the hand, which is gloved and bent in a natural way, being brought directly above the piece to be moved, descends finally upon it, the fingers receiving it, in most cases, without difficulty. Occasionally, however, when the piece is not precisely in its proper situation, the automaton fails in his attempt at seizing it. When this occurs, no second effort is made, but the arm continues its movement in the direction originally intended, precisely as if the piece were in the fingers. Having thus designated the spot whither the move should have been made, the arm returns to its cushion, and Maelzel performs the evolution which the automaton pointed out. At every movement of the figure, machinery is heard in motion. During the progress of the game, the figure now and then rolls its eyes, as if surveying the board, moves its head, and pronounces the word eşek, check, when necessary. If a false move won the making the Turk pronounce the word ec, is an improvement by Maelzel. When in possession of Baron Kempelen, the figure indicated a check by rapping on the box with his right hand. Be made by his antagonist, he raps briskly on the box with the fingers of his right hand, shakes his head roughly, and replacing the piece falsely moved, in its former situation, assumes the next move himself. Upon beating the game, he waves his head with an air of triumph, looks around complacently upon the spectators, and drawing his left arm farther back than usual, suffers his fingers alone to rest upon the cushion. In general, the Turk is victorious once or twice he has been beaten. The game being ended, Maelzel will again, if desired, exhibit the mechanism of the box, in the same manner as before. The machine is then rolled back, and a curtain hides it from the view of the company. There have been many attempts at solving the mystery of the automaton. The most general opinion in relation to it, an opinion too not unfrequently adopted by men who should have known better, was, as we have before said, that no immediate human agency was employed, in other words, that the machine was purely a machine and nothing else. Many, however, maintained that the exhibitor himself regulated the movements of the figure by mechanical means operating through the feet of the box. Others, again, spoke confidently of a magnet. Of the first of these opinions we shall say nothing at present more than we have already said. In relation to the second, it is only necessary to repeat what we have before stated, that the machine is rolled about on casters, and will, at the request of a spectator, be moved to and fro to any portion of the room, even during the progress of the game. The supposition of the magnet is also untenable, for if a magnet were the agent, any other magnet in the pocket of a spectator would disarrange the entire mechanism. The exhibitor, however, will suffer the most powerful lodestone to remain even upon the box during the whole of the exhibition. The first attempt at a written explanation of the secret, at least the first attempt of which we ourselves have any knowledge, was made in a large pamphlet printed at Paris in 1785. The author's hypothesis amounted to this: that a dwarf actuated the machine. This dwarf he supposed to conceal himself during the opening of the box by thrusting his legs into two hollow cylinders, which were represented to be, but which are not, among the machinery in the cupboard No. I, while his body was out of the box entirely, and covered by the drapery of the Turk. When the doors were shut, the dwarf was enabled to bring his body within the box, the noise produced by some portion of the machinery allowing to do so unheard, and also to close the door by he entered. The interior of the automaton being then exhibited, and no person discovered, the spectators, says the author of TMS pamphlet, are satisfied that no one is with in any portion of the machine. The whole hypothesis was too obviously absurd to require comment or refutation, and accordingly we find that it attracted very little attention. In 1789 a book was published at Dresden by Mif Freiherr, in which another endeavor was made to unravel the mystery. Mr. Freiherr's book was a pretty large one, and copiously illustrated by colored engravings. His supposition was that a well-taught boy, very thin and tall of his age, sufficiently so that he could be concealed in a drawer almost immediately under the chessboard, played the game of chess and effected all the evolutions of the automaton. This idea, although even more silly than that of the Parisian author, met with a better reception, and was in some measure believed to be the true solution of the wonder, until the inventor put an end to the discussion by suffering a close examination of the top of the box. These bizarre attempts at explanation were followed by others equally bizarre. Of late years, however, an anonymous writer, by a course of reasoning exceedingly unphilosophical, has contrived to blunder upon a plausible solution, although we cannot consider it altogether the true one. His essay was first published in a Baltimore weekly paper, was illustrated by Cutts, and was entitled An Attempt to Analyze the Automaton Chess Player of M. Maelzel. This essay we suppose to have been the original of the pamphlet to which Sir David Brewster alludes in his Letters on Natural Magic, and which he has no hesitation in declaring a thorough and satisfactory explanation. The results of the analysis are undoubtedly, in the main, just, but we can only account for Brewster's pronouncing the essay a thorough and satisfactory explanation, by supposing him to have bestowed upon it a very cursory and inattentive perusal. In the compendium of the essay, made use of in the Letters on Natural Magic, it is quite impossible to arrive at any distinct conclusion in regard to the adequacy or inadequacy of the analysis, on account of the gross misarrangement and deficiency of the letters of reference employed. The same fault is to be found in the attempt, etc., as we originally saw it. The solution consists in a series of minute explanations, accompanied by woodcuts, the whole occupying many pages, in which the object is to show the possibility of so shifting the partitions of the box, as to allow it, human being, concealed in the interior, to move portions of his body from one part of the box to another, during the exhibition of the mechanism, thus eluding the scrutiny of the spectators. There can be no doubt, as we have before observed, and as we will presently endeavor to show, that the principle, or rather the result of this solution is the true one. Some person is concealed in the box during the whole time of exhibiting the interior. We object, however, to the verbose description of the manner in which the partitions are shifted, to accommodate the movements of the person concealed. We object to it as a mere theory assumed in the first place, and to which circumstances are afterward made to adapt themselves. It was not, and could not have been, arrived at by any inductive reasoning. In whatever way the shifting is managed, it is of course concealed at every step from observation. To show that certain movements might possibly be effected in a certain way, is very far from showing that they are actually so effected. There may be an infinity of other methods by which the same results may be obtained. The probability of the one assumed proving the correct one is then as unity to infinity. But, in reality, this particular point, the shifting of the partitions, is of no consequence whatever. It was altogether unnecessary to devote 7 or 8 pages for the purpose of proving what no one in his senses would deny, viz., that the wonderful mechanical genius of Baron Kemp Elan could invent the necessary means for shutting a door or slipping aside a panel, with a human agent too at his service in actual contact with the panel or the door, and the whole operations carried on, as the author of the essay himself shows, and as we shall attempt to show more fully hereafter, entirely out of reach of the observation of the spectators. In attempting ourselves an explanation of the automaton, we will, in the first place, endeavor to show how its operations are effected, and afterward describe, as briefly as possible, the nature of the observations from which we have deduced our result. It will be necessary for a proper understanding of the subject, that we repeat here in a few words, the routine adopted by the exhibitor in disclosing the interior of the box, a routine from which he never deviates in any material particular. In the first place he opens the door No. I. Leaving this open, he goes round to the rear of the box, and opens a door precisely at the back of door No. I. To this back door he holds a lighted candle. He then closes the back door, locks it, and, coming round to the front, opens the drawer to its full extent. This done, he opens the doors number 2 and number 3, the folding doors, and displays the interior of the main compartment. Leaving open the main compartment, the drawer, and the front door of cupboard No. I, he now goes to the rear again, and throws open the back door of the main compartment. In shutting up the box no particular order is observed, except that the folding doors are always closed before the drawer. Now, let us suppose that when the machine is first rolled into the presence of the spectators, a man is already within it. His body is situated behind the dense machinery in cupboard No. I, the rear portion of which machinery is so contrived as to slip en masse, from the main compartment to the cupboard No. I, as occasion may require, and his legs lie at full length in the main compartment. When Maelzel opens the door No. I, the man within is not in any danger of discovery, for the keenest eye cannot penetrate more than about 2 inches into the darkness within. But the case is otherwise when the back door of the cupboard No. I, is opened, a bright light then pervades the cupboard, and the body of the neon would be discovered if it were there. But it is not. The putting the key in the lock of the back door was a signal on hearing which the person concealed brought his body forward to an angle as acute as possible, throwing it altogether, or nearly so, into the main compartment. This, however, is a painful position, and cannot be long maintained. Accordingly we find that Maelzel closes the back door. This being done, there is no reason why the body of the man may not resume its former situation, for the cupboard is again so dark as to defy scrutiny. The drawer is now opened, and the legs of the person within drop down behind it in the space it formerly occupied. There is, consequently, now no longer any part of the man in the main compartment, his body being behind the machinery in cupboard No. I, and his legs in the space occupied by the drawer. The exhibitor, therefore, find himself at liberty to display the main compartment. This he does opening both its back and front doors, and no person is discovered. The spectators are now satisfied that the whole of the box is exposed to view and exposed to all portions of it at one and the same time. But of course this is not the case. They neither see the space behind the drawer, nor the interior of cupboard nor the front door, of which latter the exhibitor virtually shuts in, shutting its back door. Maelzel, having now rolled the machine around, lifted up the drapery of the Turk, opened the doors in its back and thigh, and shown his trunk to be full of machinery, brings the whole back into its original position, and closes the doors. The man within is now at liberty to move about. He gets up into the body of the Turk just so high as to bring his eyes above the level of the chessboard. It is very probable that he seats himself upon the little square block or protuberance which is seen in a corner of the main compartment when the doors are open. In this position he sees the chessboard through the bosom of the Turk, which is of gauze. Bringing his right arm across his breast, he actuates the little machinery necessary to guide the left arm and the fingers of the figure. This machinery is situated just beneath the left shoulder of the Turk, and is consequently easily reached by the right hand of the man concealed, if we suppose his right arm brought across the breast. The motion of the head and eyes, and of the right arm of the figure, as well as the sound eshek, are produced by other mechanism in the interior, and actuated at will by the man within. The whole of this mechanism, that is to say, all the mechanism essential to the machine, is most probably contained within the little cupboard, of about 6 inches in breadth, partitioned off at the right, the spectator's right, of the main compartment. Sir David Brewster supposes that there is always a large space behind this drawer even when shut, in other words, that the drawer is a false drawer / and does not extend to the back of the box. But the idea is altogether untenable. So commonplace a trick would be immediately discovered, especially as the drawer is always open to its full extent, and an opportunity thus offered of comparing its depth with that of the box. In this analysis of the operations of the automaton, we have purposely avoided any allusion to the manner in which the partitions are shifted, and it will now be readily comprehended that this point is a matter of no importance, since, by mechanism within the ability of any common carpenter, it might be effected in an infinity of different ways, and since we have shown that, however performed, it is performed out of the view of the spectators, our result is founded upon the following observations taken during frequent visits to the exhibition of Maelzel 1. The moves of the Turk are not made at regular intervals of time, but accommodate themselves to the moves of the antagonist, although this point, of regularity, so important in all kinds of mechanical contrivance, might have been readily brought about by limiting the time allowed for the moves of the antagonist. For example, if this limit were 3 minutes, the moves of the automaton might be made at any given intervals longer than 3 minutes. The fact then of irregularity, when regularity might have been so easily attained, goes to prove that regularity is unimportant to the action of the automaton, in other words, that the automaton is not a pure machine. 2. When the automaton is about to move a piece, a distinct motion is observable just beneath the left shoulder, and which motion agitates in a slight degree the drapery covering the front of the left shoulder. This motion invariably precedes, by about 2 seconds, the movement of the arm itself, and the arm never, in any instance, moves without this preparatory motion in the shoulder. Now let the antagonist move a piece, and let the corresponding move be made by Maelzel, as usual, upon the board of the automaton. Then let the antagonist narrowly watch the automaton, until he detect the preparatory motion in the shoulder. Immediately upon detecting this motion, and before the arm itself begins to move, let him withdraw his piece, as if perceiving an error in his maneuver. It will then be seen that the movement of the arm, which, in all other cases, immediately succeeds the motion in the shoulder, is withheld, is not made, although Maelzel has not yet performed, on the board of the automaton, any move corresponding to the withdrawal of the antagonist. In this case, that the automaton was about to move is evident, and that he did not move, was an effect plainly produced by the withdrawal of the antagonist, and without any intervention of Maelzel. This fact fully proves, that the intervention of Maelzel, in performing the moves of the antagonist on the board of the automaton, is not essential to the movements of the automaton. 2. That its movements are 3 of these observations are intended merely to prove that the machine must be regulated by mind, and it may be thought a work of supererogation to advance further arguments in support of what has been already fully decided. But our object is to convince, in especial, certain of our friends upon whom a train of suggestive reasoning which have more influence than the most positive a priori demonstration. Regulated by mind by some person who sees the board of the antagonist. 3. That its movements are not regulated by the mind of Maelzel, whose back was turned toward the antagonist at the withdrawal of his move. 3. The automaton does not invariably win the game. Were the machine a pure machine, this would not be the case, it would always win. The principle being discovered by which a machine can be made to play a game of chess, an extension of the same principle would enable it to win a game, a further extension would enable it to win all games, that is, to beat any possible game of an antagonist. A little consideration will convince anyone that the difficulty of making a machine beat all games is not in the least degree greater, as regards the principle of the operations necessary, than that of making it beat a single game. If, then, we regard the chess player as a machine, we must suppose, what is highly improbable, that its inventor preferred leaving it incomplete to perfecting it, a supposition rendered still more absurd when we reflect that the leaving it incomplete would afford an argument against the possibility of its being a pure machine, the very argument we now adduce. For when the situation of the game is difficult or complex, we never perceive the Turk either shake his head or roll his eyes. It is only when his next move is obvious, or when the game is so circumstanced that to a man in the automaton's place there would be no necessity for reflection. Now, these peculiar movements of the head and eyes are movements customary with persons engaged in meditation, and the ingenious Baron Kemp Elan would have adapted these movements, were the machine a pure machine, to occasions proper for their display, that is, to occasions of complexity. But the reverse is seen to be the case, and this reverse applies precisely to our supposition of a man in the interior. When engaged in meditation about the game, he has no time to think of setting in motion the mechanism of the automaton by which are moved the head and the eyes. When the game, however, is obvious, he has time to look about him, and, accordingly, we see the head shake and the eyes roll. 5. When the machine is rolled round to allow the spectators an examination of the back of the Turk, and when his drapery is lifted up and the doors in the trunk and thigh thrown open, the interior of the trunk is seen to be crowded with machinery. In scrutinizing this machinery while the automaton was in motion, that is to say, while the whole machine was moving on the casters, it appeared to us that certain portions of the mechanism changed their shape and position in a degree too great to be accounted for by the simple laws of perspective, and subsequent examinations convinced us that these undue alterations were attributable to mirrors in the interior of the trunk. The introduction of mirrors among the machinery could not have been intended to influence, in any degree, the machinery itself. Their operation, whatever that operation should prove to be, must necessarily have reference to the eye of the spectator. We at once concluded that these mirrors were so placed to multiply to the vision some few pieces of machinery within the trunk so as to give it the appearance of being crowded with mechanism. Now the direct inference from this is that the machine is not a pure machine. For if it were, the inventor, so far from wishing its mechanism to appear complex, and using deception for the purpose of giving it this appearance, would have been especially desirous of convincing those who witnessed his exhibition, of the simplicity of the means by which results so wonderful were brought about. 6. The external appearance, and, especially, the deportment of the Turk, are, when we consider them as imitations of life, but very indifferent imitations. The countenance evinces no ingenuity, and is surpassed, in its resemblance to the human face, by the very commonest of waxworks. The eyes roll unnaturally in the head, without any corresponding motions of the lids or brows. The arm, particularly, performs its operations in an exceedingly stiff, awkward, jerking, and rectangular manner. Now, All this is the result either of inability in Maelzel to do better, or of intentional neglect, accidental neglect being out of the question, when we consider that the whole time of the ingenious proprietor is occupied in the improvement of his machines. Most assuredly we must not refer the unlifelike appearances to inability, for all the rest of Maelzel's automata are evidence of his full ability to copy the notions and peculiarities of life with the most wonderful exactitude. The rope dancers, for example, are inimitable. When the clown laughs, his lips, his eyes, his eyebrows, and eyelids, indeed, all the features of his countenance are imbued with their appropriate expressions. In both him and his companion, every gesture is so entirely easy, and free from the semblance of artificiality, that, were it not for the diminutiveness of their size, and the fact of their being passed from one spectator to another previous to their exhibition on the rope, it would be difficult to convince any assemblage of persons that these wooden automata were not living creatures. We cannot, therefore, doubt Mr. Maelzel's ability, and we must necessarily suppose that he intentionally suffered his chess player to remain the surrogate artificial and unnatural figure which Baron Kemp Elan, no doubt also through design, originally made it. What this design was it is not difficult to conceive. Were the automaton lifelike in its motions, the spectator would be more apt to attribute its operations to their true cause, that is, to human agency within, than he is now, when the awkward and rectangular maneuvers convey the idea of pure and unaided mechanism. 7. When, a short time previous to the commencement of the game, the automaton is wound up by the exhibitor as usual, an ear in any degree accustomed to the sounds produced in winding up a system of machinery, will not fail to discover, instantaneously, that the axis turned by the key in the box of the chess player, cannot possibly be connected with either a weight, a spring, or any system of machinery whatever. The inference here is the same as in our last observation. The winding up is inessential to the operations of the automaton, and is performed with the design of exciting in the spectators the false idea of mechanism. 8. When the question is demanded explicitly of Maelzel, is the automaton a pure machine or not, his reply is invariably the same: I will say nothing about it. Now the notoriety of the automaton, and the great curiosity it has ever excited, are owing more especially to the prevalent opinion that it is a pure machine, than to any other circumstance. Of course, then, it is the interest of the proprietor to represent it as a pure machine. And what more obvious, and more effectual method could there be of impressing the spectators with this desired idea, than a positive and explicit declaration to that effect? On the other hand, what more obvious and effectual method could there be of exciting a disbelief in the automaton's being a pure machine, than by withholding such explicit declaration? For, people will naturally reason thus: it is Maelzel's interest to represent this thing a pure machine, he refuses to do so, directly, in words, although he does not scruple and is evidently anxious to do so indirectly. By actions, were it actually what he wishes to represent it by actions, he would gladly avail himself of the more direct testimony of words. The inference is, that the consciousness of its not being a pure machine, is the reason of his silence. His actions cannot implicate him in a falsehood, his words may. 9. When, in exhibiting the interior of the box, Maelzel has thrown open the door no, and also the door immediately behind it, he holds a lighted candle at the back door, as before mentioned, and moves the entire machine to and fro with a view of convincing the company that the board no is entirely filled with machinery. When the machine is thus moved about, it will be apparent to any careful observer, that whereas that portion of the machinery near the front door no is perfectly steady and unwavering, the portion farther within fluctuates, in a very slight degree, with the movements of the machine. This circumstance first aroused in us the suspicion that the more remote portion of the machinery was so arranged as to be easily slipped, en masse, from its position when occasion should require it. This occasion we have already stated to occur when the man concealed within brings his body into an erect position upon the closing of the back door. 10 Sir David Brewster states the figure of the Turk to be of the size of life, but in fact it is far above the ordinary size. Nothing is more easy than to err in our notions of magnitude. The body of the automaton is generally insulated, and, having no means of immediately comparing it with any human form, we suffer ourselves to consider it as of ordinary dimensions. This mistake may, however, be corrected by observing the chess player when, as is sometimes the case, the exhibitor approaches it. Mr. Maelzel, to be sure, is not very tall, but upon drawing near the machine his head will be found at least 18 inches below the head of the Turk, although the latter, it will be remembered, is in a sitting position. 11. The box, behind which the automaton is placed, is precisely 3 feet 6 inches long, 2 feet 4 inches deep, and 2 feet 6 inches high. These dimensions are fully sufficient for the accommodation of a man very much above the common size, and the main compartment alone is capable of holding any ordinary man in the position we have mentioned as assumed by the person concealed. As these are facts, which anyone who doubts them may prove by actual calculation, we deem it unnecessary to dwell upon them. We will only suggest that, although the top of the box is apparently a board of about 3 inches in thickness, the spectator may satisfy himself, by stooping and looking up at it when the main compartment is open, that it is in reality very thin. The height of the drawer also will be misconceived by those who examine it in a cursory manner. There is a space of about 3 inches between the top of the drawer as seen from the exterior, and the bottom of the cupboard, a space which must be included in the height of the drawer. These contrivances to make the room within the box appear less than it actually is, are referable to a design on the part of the inventor, to impress the company again with a false idea, viz., that no human being can be accommodated within the box. 12. The interior of the main compartment is lined throughout with cloth. This cloth we suppose to have a twofold object. A portion of it may form, when tightly stretched, the only partitions which there is any necessity for removing during the changes of the man's position, viz., the partition between the rear of the main compartment and the rear of cupboard. No I, and the partition between the main compartment and the space behind the drawer when open. If we imagine this to be the case, the difficulty of shifting the partitions vanishes at once, if indeed any such difficulty could be supposed under any circumstances to exist. The second object of the cloth is to deaden and render indistinct all sounds occasioned by the movements of the person within. 13. The antagonist, as we have before observed, is not superior to play at the board of the automaton, but is seated at some distance from the machine. The reason which, most probably, would be assigned for this circumstance, if the question were demanded, is, that were the antagonist otherwise situated, his person would intervene between the machine and the spectators, and preclude the latter from a distinct view. But this difficulty might be easily obviated, either by elevating the seats of the company, or by turning the end of the box toward them during the game. The true cause of the restriction is, perhaps, voi differoit. Were the antagonists seated in contact with the box, the secret would be liable to discovery, by his detecting, with the aid of a quick ear, the breathings of the man concealed. 14. Although M. Maelzel, in disclosing the interior of the machine, sometimes slightly deviates from the routine which we have pointed out, yet never in any instance does he so deviate from it as to interfere with our solution. For example, he has been known to open, first of all, the drawer, but he never opens the main compartment without first closing the back door of cupboard No. He never opens the main compartment without first pulling out the drawer. He never shuts the drawer without first shutting the main compartment. He never opens the back door of cupboard No. While the main compartment is open, and the game of chess is never commenced until the whole machine is closed. Now, if it were observed that never, in any single instance, did M. Maelzel differ from the routine we have pointed out as necessary to our solution, it would be one of the strongest possible arguments in corroboration of it, but the argument becomes infinitely strengthened if we duly consider the circumstance that he does occasionally deviate from the routine, but never does so deviate as to falsify the solution. 1.5. There are 6 candles on the board of the automaton during exhibition. The question naturally arises, why are so many employed, when a single candle, or, at farthest, 2, would have been amply sufficient to afford the spectators a clear view of the board, in a room otherwise so well lit up as the exhibition room always is when, moreover, if we suppose the machine a pure machine, there can be no necessity for so much light, or indeed any light at all, to enable it to perform its operations, and when, especially, only a single candle is placed upon the table of the antagonist. The first and most obvious inference is, that so strong a light is requisite to enable the man within to see through the transparent material, probably fine gauze, of which the breast of the Turk is composed. But when we consider the arrangement of the candles, another reason immediately presents itself. There are 6 lights, as we have said before, in all. 3 of these are on each side of the figure. Those most remote from the spectators are the longest, those in the middle are about 2 inches shorter, and those nearest the company about 2 inches shorter still, and the candles on one side differ in height from the candles respectively opposite on the other, by a ratio different from 2 inches. That is to say, the longest candle on one side is about 3 inches shorter than the longest candle on the other, and so on. Thus it will be seen that no 2 of the candles are of the same height, and thus also the difficulty of ascertaining the material of the breast of the figure, against which the light is especially directed, is greatly augmented by the dazzling effect of the complicated crossings of the rays, crossings which are brought about by placing the centers of radiation all upon different levels. 1.6. While the chess player was in possession of Baron Kempelen, it was more than once observed, first, that an Italian in the suite of the Baron was never visible during the playing of a game at chess by the Turk. And, secondly, that the Italian being taken seriously ill, the exhibition was suspended until his recovery. This Italian professed a total ignorance of the game of chess, although all others of the suite played well. Similar observations have been made since the automaton has been purchased by Maelzel. There is a man, Schlumberger, who attends him wherever he goes, but who has no ostensible occupation other than that of assisting in the packing and unpacking of the automaton. This man is about the medium size, and has a remarkable stoop in the shoulders. Whether he professes to play chess or not, we are not informed. It is quite certain, however, that he is never to be seen during the exhibition of the chess player, although frequently visible just before and just after the exhibition. Moreover, some years ago Maelzel visited Richmond with his automata, and exhibited them, we believe, in the house now occupied by M. Bosserx as a dancing academy. Schlumberger was suddenly taken ill, and during his illness there was no exhibition of the chess player. These facts are well known to many of our citizens. The reason assigned for the suspension of the chess player's performances was not the illness of Schlumberger. The inferences from all this we leave, without farther comment, to the reader. 17. The Turk plays with his left arm. A circumstance so remarkable cannot be accidental. Brewster takes no notice of it whatever, beyond a mere statement, we believe, that such is the fact. The early writers of treatises on the automaton seem not to have observed the matter at all, and have no reference to it. The author of the pamphlet alluded to by Brewster mentions it, but acknowledges his inability to account for it. Yet it is obviously from such prominent discrepancies or incongruities as this that deductions are to be made, if made at all, which shall lead us to the truth. The circumstance of the automaton's playing with his left hand cannot have connection with the operations of the machine, considered merely as such. Any mechanical arrangement which would cause the figure to move, in any given manner, the left arm, could, if reversed, cause it to move, in the same manner, the right. But these principles cannot be extended to the human organization, wherein there is a marked and radical difference in the construction, and, at all events, in the powers, of the right and left arms. Reflecting upon this latter fact, we naturally refer the incongruity noticeable in the chess player to this peculiarity in the human organization. If so, we must imagine some reversion, for the chess player plays precisely as a man would not. These ideas, once entertained, are 439 sufficient of themselves, to suggest the notion of a man in the interior. A few more imperceptible steps lead us, finally, to the result. The automaton plays with his left arm, because under no other circumstances could the man within play with his right, a desideratum of course. Let us, for example, imagine the automaton to play with his right arm. To reach the machinery which moves the arm, and which we have before explained to lie just beneath the shoulder, it would be necessary for the man within either to use his right arm in an exceedingly painful and awkward position, viz., brought up close to his body and tightly compressed between his body and the side of the automaton, or else to use his left arm brought across his breast. In neither case could he act with the requisite ease or precision. On the contrary, the automaton playing, as it actually does, with the left arm, all difficulties vanish. The right arm of the man within is brought across his breast, and his right fingers act, without any constraint, upon the machinery in the shoulder of the figure. We do not believe that any reasonable objections can be urged against this solution of the automaton